Her name carries the weight of centuries of condemnation. But how deeply do you truly know the story of Jezebel, the queen who stood openly against God, carried foreign deities into the heart of Israel, and pursued his prophets with relentless fury? Her story ranks among the most shocking accounts found anywhere in Scripture. It is a tale woven from power, manipulation, and the final crushing hand of divine judgment. By the time this video ends, you will understand not only what she did, but why her legacy has survived across thousands of years as a cautionary voice about the cost of trading faith for earthly power. But before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. It genuinely helps. And drop a comment, letting us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. We are building a global community one viewer at a time. So without further delay, let us begin. The blood in the dust. The sun slides toward the horizon over ancient Jezebel. Dust settles along the narrow streets as shadows stretch long across the stone. A royal chariot rolls through the palace gates. The rider Jew, a military commander with a blazing intensity in his eyes, has arrived with a clear and terrible purpose. His soldiers press close around him, their weapons catching the last glint of fading daylight. High above, framed in an upper window, stands a woman. Dark kohl rings her eyes. Her face is carefully, deliberately painted. Her jewelry holds the dying sun like a mirror. She is not hiding. She is not running. She stands tall, unyielding, defiant to her final breath. "Is it peace?" calls a voice down from within the palace. But peace is not what this man brings today. "Throw her down," Jew commands, lifting his eyes to the painted queen above. The eunuchs standing beside her pause for only a moment. Their loyalty shatters. Hands press against royal robes. A scream tears through the evening air. Then comes the sickening impact of a body meeting stone. The hooves of horses crush what remains. Jew walks inside the palace to eat and drink and celebrate his conquest. Later, when servants go to bury her, for she was, after all, a king's daughter, they find almost nothing. A skull, 2 hands, 2 feet, nothing more. The rest has been taken by the wild dogs that roam those streets. "This is the word of the Lord," Jehu declares, which he spoke through Elijah the Tishbite. "On the plot of ground at Jezreel, dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh, and so ends the life of one of history's most notorious queens. A woman whose name would forever become a symbol of wickedness, seduction, and brazen defiance. A foreign princess who brought her gods into Israel. A queen who challenged prophets, snorts, and engineered murder. A ruler whose painted face in a high window remains one of the Bible's most haunting and unforgettable images. But who was Jezebel truly? Was she really the villain her enemies portrayed her to be? What forces shaped this woman? The one who dared to stand against a god not her own. To understand Jezebel, we must first understand the world that produced her. A world of rival kingdoms, ancient deities, and the ever-shifting currents of power in the ancient Near East. Her story is one of cultural collision, religious passion, and raw political hunger. It is the story of a woman who refused to bend even when faced with prophets who called fire down from heaven. It is about power, who holds it, who chases it, and what people are willing to sacrifice to keep it. In the quiet aftermath of her violent end, with dogs lapping blood from the stones of Jezreel, a question lingers in the air. How did a princess of Tyre become the most despised woman in all of Scripture? What transformed a royal daughter into the queen who defied God himself? To find that answer, we must go back before the bloodshed, before the prophets, before the very name Jezebel made the faithful tremble. We must travel to a time when Israel was young and vulnerable, surrounded by mighty empires, when the stage was quietly being arranged for one of the Bible's most explosive confrontations. The dust settles, the dogs melt back into the shadows. But Jezebel's story is far from finished. Though her body is gone, her tale endures, a warning to some, clears throat, a fascination to others, and a lasting reminder of what happens when human will meets divine purpose head-on. Long before Jezebel drew her first breath, the lands that would shape her destiny were already ancient. Israel, not yet a unified kingdom, existed as a loose gathering of tribal territories held together by shared ancestry and shared faith in Yahweh. To the north lay Phoenicia, a sophisticated maritime civilization with thriving port cities like Tyre and Sidon spread along the Mediterranean coast. These were lands of sharp and vivid contrast. Israel, still finding its footing after generations of wandering, was primarily an inland agricultural tribal society. The people lived close to the earth, following the seasonal pulse of planting and harvest. Their God was invisible, speaking through prophets and judges rather than through carved idols or grand temples. Phoenicia, by contrast, shimmered with wealth drawn from sea trade. Their ships built from the celebrated cedars of Lebanon sailed to distant shores and returned heavy with gold, silver, ivory, and rare goods. Their cities boasted impressive temples where gods and goddesses were honored through elaborate sensory rituals. Chief among their deities were Baal, the storm god who summoned rainfall, and Asherah, the goddess of fertility. The Israelites had only recently established a monarchy. After the chaotic era of the judges, the people had cried out for a king just like all the surrounding nations. First came Saul, troubled and ultimately rejected. Then David, the shepherd king, who united the tribes and captured Jerusalem. His son Solomon pushed the kingdom further still, constructing the first temple and weaving diplomatic ties with the powers around him. But when Solomon died, crisis followed. The kingdom fractured in two. Israel in the north with its capital at Samaria and Judah in the south anchored by Jerusalem. The northern kingdom where our story unfolds faced problems of legitimacy from its very first days. Its founding king Jeroboam feared his people's loyalty would drift southward if they continued making the journey to Jerusalem to worship. His solution proved fateful. He erected rival worship sites at Dan and Bethel, complete with golden calves. From the moment of its birth, the northern kingdom wrestled with questions of authentic worship. This religious instability would later provide the perfect soil for Jezebel's influence to take root. While Israel's politics shifted like sand beneath the feet, prophetic movements were quietly gaining strength. Unlike the temple priests, with their structured, ordained rituals, prophets claimed direct and personal communication with Yahweh. They appeared unexpectedly from every walk of life. Some were educated men, others were simple farmers or shepherds. What bound them together was a single bold declaration. Thus says the Lord. These prophets served as Israel's conscience, confronting kings who strayed from Yahweh's commands. They stood outside the corridors of power, unafraid to carry messages no one wanted to hear. Kings commanded armies, but prophets commanded words that could shake the very foundations of kingdoms. In the hill country, small farming communities preserved older, simpler expressions of faith. These rural believers frequently clashed with the more cosmopolitan attitudes developing in cities like Samaria. They regarded foreign alliances with suspicion, seeing them as direct threats to Israel's distinct identity and its covenant bond with Yahweh. This was the landscape into which Jezebel would eventually step. A divided kingdom, religious tensions running just beneath the surface, prophetic movements gathering momentum, and a constant grinding tension between isolation and engagement with foreign cultures. The stage was fully prepared for conflict. Israel's kings pursued political stability through alliances, while prophets demanded religious purity. Rural communities held tightly to traditional ways, while urban centers welcomed new ideas and new practices. Ancient tribal loyalties rubbed against newer political structures. In this uncertain environment, leadership changed hands repeatedly. The northern kingdom watched dynasty after dynasty collapse through assassination and coup. Without the stabilizing anchor of David's bloodline that held Judah together, Israel's throne was a dangerous prize, seized again and again through violence. This was the world waiting for Jezebel, a land of opportunity and peril, where a foreign princess might find herself holding unexpected power, and where the collision of gods and cultures was already moving toward open conflict. Ty and the daughters of Baal. Ty rose from the Mediterranean like something carved from stone and cedar and dream. Part of the city spread along the mainland, but its true heart beat on an island fortress just off the coast, nearly impossible to breach, surrounded by waters that shifted from turquoise shallows to deep sapphire depths. Here, inside one of the ancient world's greatest maritime empires, Jezebel was born a princess of the royal house. The Phoenicians were not what they called themselves. That name came from the Greeks, a reference to the deep purple dye they famously produced. They called themselves Canaanites, and their land simply the coast. Their true gift lay in trade rather than conquest. While other empires expanded through warfare, Ty built its strength through commerce and craftsmanship. Phoenician ships were the envy of every nation bordering the Mediterranean. Their sailors navigated by starlight to reach shores as distant as Spain, North Africa, perhaps even Britain, returning with silver, gold, ivory, and exotic materials that poured into Tyre's bustling harbors. The city's markets overflowed with marvels, delicate glasswork, intricately carved ivory. Textiles dyed in the legendary Tyrian purple, so costly that its wear eventually became restricted to royalty alone. In this world of wealth and refinement, religion was not a private matter. It was the pulse of daily life. Towering above the city stood the temples of Melkart, the city's patron deity, Baal Shamim, Lord of the Heavens, and Ate, Queen of Heaven. Unlike the worship of Yahweh, with its firm prohibition of physical images, Phoenician religion fully embraced the visual and the sensory. Golden statues caught the sunlight. Incense perfumed every sacred space. Music filled the air around the shrines. Baal, the storm god who delivered life-giving rain, held special importance in this seafaring culture. His consort Asher, represented by sacred poles or living trees, embodied fertility and the overflowing abundance of nature. Their worship included seasonal festivals marking the agricultural calendar, celebrations that could become quite exuberant, even sensual by Israelite standards. Temple complexes served not just as sacred spaces, but as administrative centers. Priests were not merely religious figures, but political powers who managed vast temple estates. Sacred prostitution, a practice that horrified Israelite prophets, formed part of the fertility rituals honoring Astarte. The line between religious devotion and state function blurred completely in ways that would later shape Jezebel's entire approach to power. Phoenician princesses received an education unusual for women of their era. They learned multiple languages for diplomatic purposes. They studied history, literature, and the complex religious ceremonies they would eventually need to maintain in foreign courts. A royal daughter like Jezebel would have been trained from childhood in the art of soft power in influence rather than direct authority. These daughters of Ty were valuable diplomatic instruments. Marriages secured trade routes, stabilized borders, and forged military partnerships. When a Phoenician princess traveled to a foreign court, she carried not just her dowry, but cultural connections that served her homeland long after the wedding day. She remained her father's daughter, even as she became another man's wife. The palace where Jezebel grew up hummed with international visitors. Egyptian officials in their white linen robes, Assyrian ambassadors with their carefully curled beards, merchants from distant islands speaking strange tongues. She would have watched her father, King Ahab, whose name carried the ironic meaning with Baal, navigating these diplomatic currents with practiced skill, building alliances while protecting Ty's independence. Ahab himself had risen to power through unconventional means. Ancient sources suggest he was originally a priest of Ate, who seized the throne by force. This blending of religious and political authority shaped Jezebel's understanding of power from her earliest years. She grew up seeing no contradiction whatsoever between serving the gods and wielding worldly influence. As a princess of Tyre, Jezebel's religious identity was inseparable from her political role. The gods blessed and legitimized royal authority. In return, royalty ensured proper worship through temple construction and ritual observance. The notion that religion might be separated from statecraft would have been completely foreign to her way of thinking. All of these influences combined commercial wealth, religious devotion, diplomatic skill, cultural sophistication to shape the woman who would one day cross into Israel. She was a product of one of the ancient world's most cosmopolitan societies, raised to view international connections as strength rather than compromise. She carried within her an absolute and unshakable certainty that Baal's storms brought life, that Asher's fertility ensured prosperity, that honoring these deities was both a royal duty and the salvation of any kingdom wise enough to embrace them. This worldview, so entirely natural to a daughter of Tyre, was about to collide with the fierce and uncompromising monotheism growing roots in Israel. The consequences of that collision were beyond anything either kingdom could have foreseen. The making of a princess within the palace walls of Tyre. Young Jezebel woke each morning to the voice of the sea. Waves struck the island city's foundations in a steady, ancient rhythm, a constant reminder of both protection and possibility. Her chambers, most likely overlooking the harbor, offered views of trading vessels moving in and out, their sails bright against the blue of the Mediterranean. Her daily life followed patterns established for royal daughters across countless generations. Mornings began with attendants dressing her in fine linen garments, dyed in the famous purple that announced her rank. Gold jewelry, perhaps engraved with lotus blossoms or protective symbols, adorned her wrists and throat. Cosmetics sharpened and enhanced her features, a skill she would practice her entire life, visibly so even in her very last moments. Education for a princess of Tyre reached far beyond what most women of her time could ever access. Tutors taught her to read and write, likely in several languages. The Phoenicians had developed an alphabet of only 22 letters that had revolutionized written communication across the Mediterranean world. This innovation made literacy more accessible, though it remained largely the privilege of elites. Her religious training would have been especially deep and thorough. As a royal daughter, she might one day represent Thai faith in a foreign court. She learned intricate ritual procedures, the precise timing of sacred festivals, and the distinct attributes of various deities. She memorized prayers, practiced ceremonial movements, and absorbed theological concepts, explaining how the gods engaged with human affairs. Music almost certainly filled her days. The sounds of lyres, drums, and cymbals accompanied religious ceremonies and palace entertainments alike. She may well have been trained in sacred dances, honoring Astarte movements that celebrated feminine power and the rhythms of fertility. These religious expressions, entirely natural to her, would later appear shockingly foreign to Israelite eyes. The palace itself served as a living political classroom. From behind curtains or screens, she watched her father receive foreign dignitaries, negotiate treaties, and manage the intricate web of relationships that kept Tyre prosperous. She observed how he balanced firmness with flexibility, when to press forward and when to yield. King Ahab himself is a fascinating figure. Classical sources name him as a priest of Astarte who seized the throne, possibly through violence. This origin suggests Jezebel was raised by a father who embodied both religious and political authority simultaneously, a model she would later work to replicate in Israel. His very name proclaimed divine backing for his rule. Tyre's palace complex housed far more than the royal family alone. Couriers, officials, priests, servants, and guards created a small, bustling city within the city. Young Jezebel moved through this world of competing interests and shifting alliances, learning early that power lived not only in official titles, but in relationships, in information, and, clear's throat, in perception. Meals in the palace displayed Phoenician wealth in the most tangible terms. Seafood fresh from the Mediterranean, fruits and vegetables from the fertile coastal plains, wines imported from across the known world, all served on finely crafted dishes of silver or delicate pottery. Dining was not merely nourishment, but a performance of status and an ongoing opportunity for political conversation. From the women's quarters, Jezebel absorbed practical wisdom passed down through her mother, her aunts, and the female courtiers around her. They taught her how to manage a royal household, the critical importance of producing heirs, and the subtle ways a woman could shape decisions in power structures built and run by men. She learned that a queen's real authority often moved through indirect channels. Counsel given in private moments, strategic bonds formed with key court officials, careful control over who gained access to the king. Religious festivals broke the year into vivid, memorable chapters. During Baal's autumn ceremonies, the palace and city together celebrated the arrival of seasonal rains so vital to agriculture. Spring rites honored Astarte with expressions of fertility and renewal. These celebrations, rich with music, feasting, and sometimes sensual energy, formed Jezebel's deepest understanding of what proper worship looked and felt like. It was dramatically unlike the austere and imageless rituals of Yahweh. As she matured, Jezebel would have fully understood her most likely destiny: marriage to a foreign ruler for the purpose of political alliance. Phoenician royal women were raised with this expectation from childhood. They were living treaties, physical embodiment of agreements between kingdoms. Their marriages created blood bonds between royal houses and opened trade corridors that enriched both nations in return. What may have set Jezebel apart was the sheer intensity of her religious devotion. Later events strongly suggest she was not merely a nominal follower of Baal and Asherah, but a true and committed believer, someone with a genuine drive to see their worship spread beyond Tyre's borders. Whether this fervor developed in her earliest years or emerged later in life remains uncertain, but her actions inside Israel reveal a woman who would not abandon her gods, even when doing so would have been the politically safer choice. As she grew into young womanhood and began appearing at more public state functions, Jezebel became visible to the foreign emissaries who passed through Tyre. Her beauty, her intelligence, and her royal bearing made her a valuable diplomatic asset. And somewhere in those encounters, representatives from a divided kingdom to the south from Israel took notice of this princess who might bring Phoenician wealth and naval power into alliance with their own nation. Israel without a queen. Israel's northern kingdom trembled with instability. Unlike the southern kingdom of Judah, held steady by the unbroken line of David's descendants, the north suffered constant upheaval. Kings rose and fell with alarming speed, many removed not through natural succession, but through bloodshed. The land needed not merely a ruler, but a stabilizing force, perhaps a queen who might bring international connection and a measure of domestic continuity at once. After Solomon's death and the kingdom's fracture, Israel's troubles arrived almost immediately. Jeroboam, its founding king, feared his people's loyalty would slip southward if they continued making pilgrimage to Jerusalem's temple. His solution proved fateful. He established competing worship sites at Dan and Bethel, complete with golden calves, and proclaimed, "Here are your gods, O Israel," deliberately echoing the words spoken during Israel's wilderness rebellion centuries before. This religious compromise established a pattern. Northern kings repeatedly chose political expediency over religious faithfulness. The prophets condemned it without hesitation. But from a pragmatic standpoint, these kings were solving real problems. How do you govern a breakaway kingdom? How do you build a distinct national identity with Jerusalem's temple pulling your people's hearts southward. Violence defined every transfer of power. Jeroboam's son Nadab ruled for only 2 years before being struck down by Baasha, who then exterminated the entire royal family around him. Baasha's own son, Eli, met a parallel fate. Murdered while drunk by his chariot commander, Zimri, who then eliminated every male relative of the previous dynasty. Zimri himself enjoyed exactly 7 days on the throne. When news of his coup reached Israel's army in the field, the soldiers immediately proclaimed their general Omri as king instead. Zimri, cornered inside the palace at Zar, set the building ablaze and died in the flames rather than submit to capture. Civil war followed as a rival claimant named Tibni gathered his own supporters against Omri. For 4 years, the land suffered under divided loyalties before Omri finally prevailed. This unrelenting bloodshed created a kingdom where trust had become scarce and security even scarcer. Royal children grew up knowing their bloodline alone could make them targets. Court officials watched constantly for shifting winds of power. Ordinary people suffered under distracted and perpetually insecure leadership. Against this turbulent backdrop rose Omri, a military commander whose real talent lay in practical solutions rather than religious devotion. Though the Bible dismisses him in sharp terms as doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, secular records reveal his substantial accomplishments. He established a brand new capital at Samaria, strategically positioned on a defensible hill with commanding views of the surrounding valleys. The site offered natural springs crucial for survival during any siege. Omri achieved something his predecessors had failed to deliver: enough stability to actually found a dynasty. Under his leadership, Israel gained genuine international recognition. Assyrian records refer to Israel as the House of Omri long after his death, a measure of how deeply his impact on regional politics was felt. He secured his borders through military strength and diplomatic marriages, establishing ties with neighboring Judah through the union of his son Ahab with Judean princess Athaliah. As Omri grew older, his son Ahab stepped into governance alongside him, preparing to inherit the stability his father had fought so hard to create. But one essential piece of their political strategy remained missing: a strong northern alliance to balance their southern connection with Judah. Phoenicia, with its maritime strength and commercial wealth, offered the perfect counterweight. While politically shrewd, these arrangements carried religious complications. Marriage alliances in the ancient Near East routinely required respect for the bride's original faith. Royal women brought not just their dowries but their priests, their sacred objects, and the expectation of continued worship. This custom standard in the international diplomacy of the period would place direct pressure on Israel's commitment to Yahweh alone. The prophetic movement had grown stronger through these unstable years. Prophets emerged as countercultural voices challenging royal authority wherever it strayed from covenant faithfulness. Unlike court prophets who shaped their words to please their patrons, these independent figures delivered uncomfortable truths, often at great personal risk. Rural Israelites, particularly in the northern hill country, had maintained stricter devotion to traditional Yahweh worship. They watched their king's religious compromises with growing alarm. These tensions between urban pragmatism and rural traditionalism, between political necessity and religious purity, had carved deep fault lines through Israelite society. The absence of a prominent queen figure in this period is worth noting. Kings had wives certainly, but historical records offer no woman who significantly shaped the politics of the northern kingdom before Jezebel arrived. Her entrance would fill that vacuum with a force no one was fully prepared for, bringing a feminine authority into a landscape shaped almost entirely by male violence. By the time Ahab prepared to take his father's throne, Israel urgently needed stability. The kingdom had survived decades of assassination, civil war, and religious fracture. Omri had begun the work of healing through military strength and political calculation. Now his son would continue that work by reaching northward toward Phoenicia, seeking alliance with the sophisticated maritime power whose princess might bring both international prestige and commercial advantage to Israel. Neither father nor son could have imagined how deeply this political calculation would transform Israel's religious landscape. The princess they were reaching for was no passive diplomatic symbol. She was a woman of fierce conviction and inexhaustible will. Jezebel, devoted servant of Baal and Asher, soon to become the most controversial queen in the entire history of Israel. A deal is struck. In the opulent throne room of Tyre, two kings sat down to reshape the political map: Ethbol of Phoenicia and Omri of Israel, both pragmatic rulers who had reached their thrones through unconventional paths, recognized clear and mutual advantages in an alliance. Their discussions likely unfolded over months, carried first through intermediaries before any direct meeting, and centered firmly on shared benefit rather than shared values. Phoenicia offered what Israel desperately needed: international legitimacy, trade connections, and access to luxury goods that could elevate the northern kingdom standing among its neighbors. Israel, in return, offered Phoenicia an inland buffer against potential enemies and secured trade routes running south toward Jerusalem and beyond. The proposed marriage between Tyre's princess Jezebel and Israel's crown prince Ahab would seal these advantages in flesh and in blood. Marriage contracts in the ancient Near East functioned as international treaties. Their terms specified not just dowry amounts but religious accommodations, trade agreements, and military commitments. Ethbal would have insisted on clear provisions allowing his daughter to continue, clear as throat, practicing her faith. Omri, focused on political gain rather than religious purity, likely regarded this as a small concession in exchange for major advantages. For Jezebel herself, the moment of agreement surely arrived with complicated emotions. Marriage to a foreign prince meant permanent separation from her homeland. Though she had been raised expecting exactly this fate, the reality would have carried real weight. Yet, diplomatic marriages also opened unusual doors for female influence. As her father's living representative in a foreign court, she would carry an authority that reached beyond the typical role of a royal wife. Preparations began at once. Her dowry, likely including gold, silver, fine textiles, and possibly skilled Phoenician craftsmen, was assembled with care. Priests of Baal and Asher were selected to accompany her, ensuring that proper worship could continue in her new home. Servants, handmaidens, and trusted advisors were chosen to form her household in Israel. Each person represented a living thread of connection back to Tyre, ensuring she would not stand utterly alone in a foreign land. The physical journey from Tyre to Samaria traced ancient trade routes winding through coastal plains before turning inland toward the hills of Israel. The royal procession with its guards, pack animals, and covered carriages would have moved slowly through the land, creating anticipation in every village it passed through. For many ordinary Israelites, this would be their first glimpse of Phoenician wealth and their first look at the foreign princess about to become their queen. In Samaria, King Omri oversaw preparations for the bride's arrival. His still developing capital required accommodations worthy of a princess raised in cosmopolitan Tyre. Perhaps this drove the construction of the ivory house mentioned in later biblical texts, a palace adorned with ivory carvings that archaeological excavations have since confirmed existed in ancient Samaria. These luxury items, many carrying distinctly Phoenician motifs, were the physical embodiment of the cultural exchange this marriage represented. News of the coming royal wedding spread through Israel with decidedly mixed reactions. Court officials saw fresh opportunities for wealth and influence through new Phoenician connections. Merchants anticipated expanded trade, but rural communities and those devoted to traditional Yahweh worship received the news with alarm. A foreign queen meant foreign gods on Israelite soil. Prophets outside the royal court system raised early warnings. Though specific recorded denunciations from this early period are sparse in the biblical texts, later prophetic attitudes make clear that resistance was present from the beginning. These figures, dressed plainly and speaking with blunt directness, stood in vivid contrast to the polished Phoenician priests arriving in Jezebel's entourage. When Ahab and Jezebel finally came face to face, they encountered partners shaped by radically different worlds. He was the son of a military commander, raised in a kingdom torn by civil war and assassination, where survival had frequently demanded compromise over principle. She was a princess of sophisticated Tyre, educated in both religious and political affairs, accustomed from birth to seeing divine authority and royal authority as one and the same thing. Their wedding wove together elements from both cultures, a diplomatic dance, honoring two traditions while creating something entirely new. Omri almost certainly used the celebration to showcase his kingdom's growing prosperity. For many Israelite nobles, this event offered their first genuine taste of Phoenician luxury and cultural sophistication, exotic and enticing and deeply unsettling all at once. The political benefits came quickly and visibly. Israel gained standing among neighboring powers through its new connection to the prestigious city of Tyre. Trade increased along protected routes between the kingdoms. Phoenician architectural and artistic influence began appearing in Samaria, shaping a more cosmopolitan capital that reflected Omri's vision for his previously overlooked kingdom. But beneath those material gains, religious tensions were already quietly simmering. The marriage contract's provisions allowing Jezebel to worship Baal and Asherah required physical space for that practice. Temples or shrines needed to be built. Ritual objects needed housing. Priests needed accommodation. Each visible sign of these foreign religions deepened the unease among those committed to Yahweh alone. Neither Omri nor Ethbaal could have predicted how profoundly this marriage would reshape Israel's future. What had begun as standard diplomatic practice, a princess married for alliance and permitted to maintain her original faith, would grow into something far more divisive. Jezebel, raised to understand religious and political authority as absolutely inseparable, would not settle for quiet private devotion tucked away in a side chapel. She had brought with her not only her gods, but a missionary conviction that would transform and fracture her adopted homeland. The deal made between two aging kings seeking practical advantages had released forces neither man truly understood. A new chapter in Israel's religious story had begun, not through conquest or force, but through the entirely common diplomatic custom of a marriage alliance. The storm that would follow remained for now only a distant cloud gathering on the horizon. Arrival in Samaria. The procession wound its way up the final approach to Samaria. At its center, sheltered from sun and dust beneath elaborate canopies, traveled Jezebel, no longer merely a princess of Tyre, but now the bride of Israel's crown prince. The city rising before her must have appeared both impressive and provincial compared to the island kingdom she had left behind. Samaria was Omri's great achievement, a capital constructed from nothing on a hilltop, commanding all the surrounding valleys. Its location combined natural defense with proximity to vital trade routes. Construction was still ongoing, with workers laying stone for expanded fortifications even as the wedding procession drew near. This was a city in the act of becoming something greater, much like the kingdom it served. The crowds lining the approach revealed the full range of Israel's society. Court officials in their finest garments stood closest to the gates, ready with formal welcomes. Behind them gathered merchants eager for Phoenician trade connections, artisans curious about foreign craftsmanship, and ordinary people simply drawn by the spectacle of it all. Further back, watching with carefully guarded expressions, stood rural Israelites, whose devotion to Yahweh made them instinctively suspicious of any foreign influence. For Jezebel, this first exposure to her new people would have confirmed what diplomatic briefings had likely already told her. Israel was a kingdom divided not only from Judah, but within itself. Religious tensions, tribal loyalties, and the still raw wounds of civil war had produced a deeply fragmented society. Where she may have seen an opportunity for unifying influence, others saw threatening foreign intrusion. The formal welcome would have followed ancient protocols, ritualized speeches, symbolic gifts, carefully choreographed movements acknowledging both her royal status and her new role as Ahab's wife. King Omri, aging but still commanding in bearing, likely led these ceremonies, establishing publicly before all witnesses that this marriage carried his complete and unreserved support. Ahab himself remains something of a mystery in these early interactions. The biblical texts offer very little insight into what he felt toward his Phoenician bride. Political marriages rarely began with personal warmth, but the most successful ones often developed genuine partnership over time. What is clear is that throughout their marriage, Ahab never moved to restrict Jezebel's religious practices or her political influence, suggesting either genuine agreement with her activities or a simple inability to contain them. Jezebel's first days in Samaria involved navigating an unfamiliar landscape, both physical and social. The palace complex, though impressive by Israelite standards, likely fell short of a princess raised among the splendors of Tyre. Local foods, clothing styles, and daily customs all required adjustment. Even the climate was different. Samaria's inland position meant hotter summers and sharper winters than the coastal city she had always known. Language presented another barrier. Though her diplomatic education had likely introduced her to Hebrew, the nuances of local speech and the unspoken regional expressions would have escaped her in those early months. This disadvantage could be and likely was exploited by court officials resistant to her growing influence, with conversations shifting smoothly into local idioms whenever sensitive topics arose. Establishing her religious practices created immediate complications. The marriage agreement guaranteed her right to worship her gods, but making that right real required physical space and financial resources. Where would Baal's temples stand? Who would fund the upkeep of the priests? How would the sacred festivals be observed? These were not merely logistical questions. Each one carried profound theological weight in a land bound by covenant to Yahweh alone. The Israelite court ladies assigned to attend her represented yet another layer of complexity. Some surely viewed the assignment as an honor, eager to absorb Phoenician fashions and customs at close range. Others may have been placed deliberately as informants, reporting her movements and conversations to various court factions. Jezebel needed to sort allies from adversaries, while every face around her was still as strangers. Rural prophets, those operating entirely outside the support of court patronage, registered immediate protest. Though specific denunciations from this early period are not preserved in the biblical texts, later prophetic attitudes make the early resistance unmistakably clear. These figures, often dressed in rough, simple clothing, and speaking with blunt and unsparing directness, stood in sharp relief against the polished Phoenician priests who had made the journey with Jezebel's household. Despite all these challenges, Jezebel held significant advantages. Her education had prepared her for precisely this kind of diplomatic complexity. She arrived carrying considerable wealth, which could purchase loyalty and secure influence. And above everything else, she carried her father's authority as his daughter and his representative, a status that extended well beyond simply being Ahab's wife. Gradually, she established her own household within the broader palace structure. Phoenician decorative elements began appearing in the spaces around her. Furniture inlaid with ivory, wall hangings bearing distinctive motifs from her homeland, the subtle but steady introduction of her cultural aesthetic into Israelite spaces. These visible changes were outward signs of the far deeper transformations her presence was beginning to bring. As Omri's health declined, Ahab moved increasingly into active governance with Jezebel beside him. The transition following Omri's death proved smoother than any previous royal succession in the northern kingdom's memory, marking the first genuinely peaceful transfer of power in its turbulent history. The stability Omri had worked so hard to build through the Phoenician alliance seemed, at least on the surface, to be holding. Yet beneath that surface, tensions kept building. Every visible expression of Baal worship, every altar raised, every priest installed, every festival observed, drove the wedge a little deeper between those who welcomed international connection and those who remained committed to traditional Yahweh worship. Jezebel had arrived physically in Samaria, but the cultural and religious integration her presence represented remained bitterly contested. In those early days before open conflict broke through the surface, she likely believed she was simply fulfilling her natural role as a royal daughter and diplomatic wife. The practices that felt entirely normal to her, honoring her gods, promoting cultural exchange, strengthening her husband's court, appeared to others as something altogether more dangerous, the corruption of Israel's soul by foreign hands. The stage was set for a collision, not merely between individuals, but between two fundamentally different visions of what Israel was and what it was meant to be. Ahab, the puppet, or the player. The man who shared Jezebel's bed and throne remains one of history's most genuinely ambiguous kings. Was Ahab a weak-willed husband moved entirely by his foreign wife? Or was he a shrewd political operator who used her influence to advance his own agenda while keeping his own hands clean? The biblical narrative casts him primarily as a figure pulled along by Jezebel's strings, but archaeological evidence and a careful reading of the text together suggests something considerably more complex. Unlike his father Omri, who clawed his way upward from military command to seize the throne, Ahab was born into royal expectations. He inherited not just a crown but a kingdom that had for the first time achieved genuine stability after generations of violence. That inheritance shaped his priorities. Maintain the peace his father had built. Continue the diplomatic relationships that protected Israel's borders. Sustain the prosperity that legitimized his dynasty's right to rule. Physically, we can only imagine what Ahab looked like. No portraits survive, but the palaces excavated at Samaria speak clearly of a king who surrounded himself with luxury. Ivory carvings, fine masonry, and ambitious building projects suggest a ruler with a strong appreciation for material splendor. Perhaps this shared aesthetic sensibility formed an early and genuine bond with his Phoenician bride, whose homeland was unrivaled in exactly those crafts. The biblical account notes Ahab's ivory house, not a structure built entirely from ivory, of course, but a palace adorned with ivory panels and inlaid furniture. Archaeological discoveries confirm that ivory decorations, many bearing distinctly Phoenician motifs, were a real feature of elite buildings in Samaria during this period. These luxury objects represented not just personal wealth but international connection, tangible proof of Israel's growing cosmopolitanism under Omri and Ahab. As a military leader, Ahab demonstrated genuine and noteworthy skill. Both biblical and Assyrian records confirm that he successfully defended Israel against powerful threats, particularly from Syria. At the Battle of Karkar, he contributed one of the largest chariot contingents in a coalition of regional kings standing against Assyrian expansion. These accomplishments sit in sharp tension with the image of incompetence that his religious failures might otherwise suggest. In domestic governance, Ahab showed real administrative ability. He continued his father's ambitious building programs, strengthening fortifications at strategic locations across the kingdom. Under his rule, Israel's economy grew with archaeological evidence pointing to increased trade activity and expanding material wealth. Whatever his spiritual failings, he delivered the security and prosperity that ancient subjects expected from a capable king. His relationship with Jezebel resists simple description. The Bible records not a single instance where Ahab directly opposed her will, which suggests either genuine agreement with her actions or an inability to check them. When she arranged Naboth's death to take his vineyard, Ahab accepted the illicitly obtained land without visible protest. Yet when Elijah confronted him over it, he showed what appeared to be genuine remorse, tearing his garments and fasting in an act of contrition, serious enough to briefly delay the divine judgment declared against him. This pattern surfaces again and again. Ahab permits religious innovations that deeply offend traditional Yahwism, benefits from Jezebel's bold and decisive actions, while maintaining a degree of personal distance from them, then displays regret when a prophet arrives to hold him accountable. Is this the behavior of a dominated husband? Or is it the calculated conduct of a king who allows his foreign wife to absorb the criticism for policies that ultimately serve his interests? The Bible describes their marriage in notably strong terms. There was never anyone like Ahab, who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel, his wife. That phrase, urged on rather than forced or deceived, points toward partnership more than domination. It implies Ahab's willing participation in choices that the prophetic writers found indefensible. Court dynamics almost certainly amplified Jezebel's influence. As the daughter of Tyre's king, she brought international prestige to a relatively young and still vulnerable dynasty. Her connections opened trade relationships and cultural exchanges that generated real economic benefits for Israel. The Phoenician priests and attendants who had arrived with her from Tyre formed a ready and loyal faction within the palace structure. Ahab's own religious posture appears pragmatic rather than passionate. Unlike Jezebel, who actively championed the cause of Baal worship, he seems to have practiced a syncretic approach fairly common among ancient rulers, honoring various deities as political circumstance demanded. He maintained the structures of Yahweh's worship while allowing Baal's temples to stand, spreading his spiritual bets while maximizing his political options. Their children's names reveal this religious complexity in the most direct way. Some receive traditional Yahwistic names containing the Hebrew divine element, Yah or El, while others bore names honoring Baal. This pattern suggests not a royal household wholly captured by Phoenician religion, but one where multiple traditions operated simultaneously, exactly the kind of blended compromise that would enrage any religious purist. One can only imagine the conversations that passed between this royal couple at the end of a long day. Did they quietly strategize together about managing religious tensions in the kingdom? Did Ahab privately endorse policies he kept himself visibly clear of in public? Did Jezebel consciously understand her role as the lightning rod, drawing the full fury of prophetic criticism away from her husband? The biblical text offers tantalizing suggestions, but no definitive answers. What does seem clear is that they built a functional and durable partnership, whatever its internal power dynamics may have been. Together, they governed Israel through a period of relative prosperity and genuine military success. Their dynasty appeared secure, with sons ready to carry the legacy forward. By the practical measures of ancient kingship, wealth, security, and dynastic continuity, their reign succeeded despite the unrelenting prophetic condemnation it attracted. Perhaps that worldly success helps explain their confidence in the face of prophetic opposition. From inside the palace, surrounded by evidence of divine favor expressed in material abundance, the doom-laden warnings of figures like Elijah must have seemed disconnected from observable reality. When the rains came and the harvests were full, even while Baal was worshipped alongside Yahweh, why take seriously the warnings of divine punishment? This complacency would prove fatal in the end. The religious compromises that had seemed so politically reasonable deepened fractures within Israelite society over time. The resentments Jezebel generated through her aggressive promotion of foreign worship built up a store of enemies, waiting quietly for their moment. The prophetic movements they had dismissed as irrelevant grew only stronger through the experience of persecution. Ahab died as he had lived, a man full of contradictions. Mortally wounded in battle, despite having disguised himself to avoid being singled out as a target, he ordered his charioteer to keep him propped upright, facing the enemy, so that his troops would not lose heart at the sight of a fallen king. That final act of stubborn kingly responsibility suggests a man considerably more complex than a simple puppet on a string. Whether player or played, Ahab's choices set in motion consequences that would eventually bring down everything he and Jezebel had built together. The rise of the prophets. Wind moved across the dry hills of Gilead, stirring the rough camel hair garment of a solitary figure. From this remote region east of the Jordan came the man who would become Jezebel's most formidable adversary, Elijah the Tishbite. His sudden entrance into the biblical narrative mirrors the way prophets so often stepped onto Israel's political stage, unexpectedly dramatically from the margins of society, rather than its centers of power. Prophets were not new to Israel. From the earliest days, figures like Moses, Deborah, and Samuel had spoken with divine authority. But the prophetic movement taking shape during Ahab and Jezebel's reign marked something different, more confrontational, more willing to challenge royal authority head-on, more urgently focused on calling Israel back to the exclusive worship of Yahweh. These prophets stood entirely outside the established religious system. Unlike priests who held their positions through hereditary lines and carried defined temple responsibilities, prophets appeared without warning from any social class or tribe. They claimed their authority not from human appointment, but from divine calling, and they described that calling in visceral, almost physical terms. "The hand of the Lord came upon me. The word of the Lord burned in my bones like fire." Their very appearance carried its own message. Elijah's rough clothing and untamed look created an unmistakable and deliberate contrast with the polished sophistication of Ahab's court. Later, his successor, Elisha, would be mocked for his boldness, perhaps yet another visible rejection of the carefully groomed fashions of court culture. These were not diplomatic advisors. They were disruptive truth-tellers. Their methods proved equally striking. Rather than delivering carefully worded recommendations through proper channels, these prophets created public spectacles that were simply impossible to ignore. They carried out symbolic acts, delivered proclamations in open marketplaces, and stood face-to-face with kings without regard for ceremony or protocol. Their purpose was never to nudge policy along slowly, but to call for an immediate return to covenant faithfulness. The heart of their message was singular, undivided loyalty to Yahweh. While court prophets tended to echo whatever kings wished to hear, these independent voices delivered truths that stung and disturbed. Worshipping Baal alongside Yahweh was not acceptable diplomatic flexibility. It was spiritual betrayal. Israel had one God, one covenant, one calling as a people set apart. Elijah embodied this emerging prophetic model in its most powerful form. His very name, meaning, "My God is Yahweh," announced his message before he even opened his mouth. He appeared without warning before King Ahab and declared drought, directly striking at Baal's supposed dominion over rainfall. This was not a simple religious disagreement. It was a public contest of power between rival deities with agricultural abundance and human survival as the prize. For common Israelites, especially those in rural communities, these prophets gave voice to spreading anxieties about foreign influence. The northern kingdom had wrestled with its religious identity ever since its break from Jerusalem's temple. Now, with Phoenician customs openly championed by the queen herself, many feared losing their unique covenant bond with Yahweh altogether. Jezebel's reaction to this prophetic opposition exposed her fundamental misreading of Israel's religious landscape. In Phoenicia, religious diversity was the norm, and royal patrons exercised direct control over priesthoods. She expected a similar arrangement in Israel, where kings stretching back to Jeroboam had established and reshaped places of worship. What she failed to grasp was that Yahweh's prophets claimed an authority entirely outside the reach of royal control. Her campaign against these prophets, described in Scripture as a deliberate and systematic effort to wipe them out, arose from both political strategy and personal religious conviction. From where she stood, these figures endangered the cultural integration she was building and the royal authority she was determined to uphold. Eliminating them seemed not just practically wise, but spiritually justified, removing obstacles standing in the way of Baal's rightful place. This persecution carried with it an unintended result. The prophets began to organize. The biblical text speaks of the sons of the prophets, communities that gathered around charismatic leaders like Elijah and later Elisha. These groups preserved traditions, offered one another support, and raised up new prophetic voices. A persecution meant to silence opposition instead gave it roots and structure. Obadiah, a senior official within Ahab's court, illustrates the difficult position of those caught between competing allegiances. Scripture describes him sheltering 100 prophets in caves, supplying them with food and water, while keeping his post in a court growing ever more hostile to Yahweh worship. His story points to widespread quiet resistance to Jezebel's religious agenda, even among those who appeared on the surface to go along. As drought tightened its grip across the land, fulfilling Elijah's declaration, tensions built toward a collision that could not be avoided. The physical hardship forced spiritual questions into sharp relief. Which God truly commanded the rain? Which form of worship guaranteed prosperity? Was Israel suffering the consequence of broken covenant or simply an unfortunate natural event? The prophetic movement offered clear and unsparing answers. Return exclusively to Yahweh. Cast away foreign gods, and abundance would follow. This message found especially fertile ground among rural populations already distrustful of urban cosmopolitanism and outside customs. As conditions worsened under the drought, these arguments gathered weight and urgency. For Jezebel, however, the drought likely pointed in the opposite direction. It probably signaled to her that Baal required more devoted worship, not less. From within her theological framework, the remedy for withheld rain was greater dedication, more priests, more elaborate ritual, more sacrifice. This placed her in precise opposition to everything Elijah demanded. With such irreconcilable understandings of the divine, conflict was not merely likely, but inevitable. This rising prophetic movement beyond royal control, claiming direct inspiration from God, and growing more organized by the day despite ongoing persecution, created a challenge to monarchical power in Israel, unlike anything before it. Kings could no longer reshape religious practice without encountering fierce and vocal resistance. Political convenience could no longer simply override covenant duty without prophetic protest rising to meet it. Everything was moving toward dramatic confrontation, royal authority against prophetic calling, Phoenician religious openness against Israelite covenantal exclusivity, Jezebel's iron resolve against Elijah's absolute certainty. The theological conflict had become inseparable from questions of power, identity, and Israel's very reason for existing as a nation among nations. The war of the gods begins. The third year of drought had baked the earth hard as iron. Streams shrank to dusty channels, crops shriveled in cracked fields. Livestock grew lean and then perished. In palaces and in peasant homes alike, hunger gnawed and thirst burned without relief. This was not merely a weather event, it was warfare, a divine conflict unfolding through human suffering. Elijah's declaration of drought had struck directly at Baal's core identity as the storm god who brought life-giving rain. In Phoenician theology, Baal triumphed over the gods of death and drought in cosmic battle, guaranteeing the harvest through seasonal rainfall. Now, in the very territory where Baal was said to reign, rain had ceased entirely. The theological weight of that silence hung in the air as heavily as the absent storm clouds. For Jezebel, this crisis demanded a religious response. Archaeological evidence from across the region shows that drought regularly triggered intensified religious activity, more sacrifices, more elaborate ceremonies, and more desperate appeals to the gods. As Baal's most devoted patron, she almost certainly escalated her support for worship practices, drawing from the royal treasury to fund additional priests and offerings in hopes of restoring divine favor. The biblical text references 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asher eating at Jezebel's table, pointing to royal sponsorship conducted on a striking scale. These were not minor cult figures, but a substantial religious establishment maintained at royal expense. Their presence throughout Israel represented a deliberate and organized effort to plant Phoenician worship alongside or in place of traditional Yahwism. Physical traces of this religious transformation have surfaced through archaeological excavations. Altars, sacred poles associated with Asher, and ritual objects connected to Canaanite deities have been found in Israelite settings from this period. Some households kept modest shrines with figurines of Baal or Asher placed alongside symbols of Yahweh, material proof of the religious blending that the prophets condemned so fiercely. Architectural remains point to temples constructed in Samaria and other cities following Phoenician designs, rather than the pattern of the Jerusalem temple. These structures made Baal worship visibly present in urban centers, normalized through imposing buildings that rivaled or surpassed the spaces dedicated to Yahweh. Fine stonework, imported cedar, and decorative flourishes all broadcast royal endorsement of these newer religious practices. For ordinary Israelites, all of this created daily dilemmas with real consequences. Should they walk past Baal's temple, or go out of their way to avoid it? Should they take part in public festivals honoring foreign gods, or risk appearing disloyal to the crown? Should they hold firmly to exclusive Yahweh worship, or hedge their spiritual commitments during drought by honoring the storm god as well? These were not abstract theological exercises. They were practical decisions that shaped social relationships, economic prospects, and sometimes personal safety. Rural communities generally held more firmly to traditional Yahweh worship, while urban centers tended to embrace religious change more easily. This geographic divide deepened existing fault lines between cosmopolitan elites who welcomed international influences and rural traditionalists who guarded ancestral practice. The religious conflict ran along social and economic lines, widening fractures already present in the fabric of society. Elijah watched all of this from hiding. The biblical narrative places him first at the Kerth Brook, then in the home of a widow at Zarephath, located with a certain irony deep inside Phoenician territory, where Jezebel's search parties would never think to look. These years of withdrawal were not passive waiting, but intentional preparation for the confrontation still to come. Divine provision through ravens and the miraculous replenishment of oil and flour demonstrated Yahweh's power even in the heart of Baal's homeland. When the command to return finally came, Elijah first sought out Obadiah, the court official quietly loyal to Yahweh's prophets. Their careful exchange reveals the climate of fear that surrounded any open dissent. Obadiah at first refused to carry word of Elijah's return to Ahab, convinced the prophet would vanish again and leave him facing the king's fury. Only after receiving solemn assurance did he agree to arrange the meeting. The encounter between king and prophet crackled with tension. Ahab's opening words is that you troubler of Israel, place the blame for the drought suffering squarely on Elijah. The prophet's response redirected it without hesitation. It is not I who have troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, for you have abandoned the commands of Yahweh and followed the Baal. This exchange captures the two men's fundamentally opposing frameworks. In Ahab's view, Elijah's pronouncement had caused the drought, making the prophet responsible for years of collective misery. In Elijah's view, the drought was simply the consequence of the royal family's religious unfaithfulness now becoming visible. One saw a political agitator. The other understood himself to be a divine messenger. What followed stands among Scripture's most dramatic passages. Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal to a public contest on Mount Carmel. This was not a theological debate. It was high-stakes theater, with life and death hanging in the balance. Before an assembled crowd of Israelites, the most fundamental questions would be answered. Which God held power over nature? Which form of worship secured prosperity? Which religious tradition would define Israel's future? Elijah's challenge carried tremendous rhetorical force. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. This framing refused the syncretistic compromise so many Israelites had quietly adopted. No more holding both positions at once. The time for either or had arrived. No more hedged bets or divided loyalties. Complete commitment was the only acceptable response. The prophets of Baal accepted the challenge, confident their God would answer. From early morning until midday, they cried out to Baal, dancing around their altar with mounting desperation as silence continued. Elijah's mockery, suggesting their God might be deep in thought, or traveling, or perhaps asleep and in need of waking, hauled humiliation over their growing panic. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, they slashed themselves with swords and spears, their blood running freely, hoping that such an offering might draw divine attention. When Elijah's turn arrived, he moved with deliberate and ceremonial care. He rebuilt a ruined altar of Yahweh using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, connecting the present crisis to the bedrock of ancestral faith. He dug a trench around it. He arranged the wood and laid the offering in place. Then he called for water, a striking gesture in a land withered by 3 years of drought. 4 large jars were emptied over the sacrifice, then 4 more, then 4 again until the trench itself overflowed. His prayer when it came was brief and direct, centered entirely on covenant relationship rather than any form of magical formula. Answer me, Yahweh. Answer me so that this people may know that you, Yahweh, are God. Fire fell from heaven. Not a flicker or a spark, but a consuming blaze that devoured the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil beneath them, and the water pulled in the trench. The assembled crowd fell face down, crying out, Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. In that moment of absolute religious clarity, Elijah ordered the prophets of Baal seized. Their execution at the Kishon Valley, jarring to modern readers, but entirely consistent with the ancient understanding of false prophecy's consequences, removed Jezebel's religious leadership in a single decisive act. Rain clouds began gathering on the horizon. The 3-year drought broke with a drenching downpour. Elijah, filled with divine energy, outran Ahab's chariot all the way back to Jezreel. The contest appeared to be over and completely settled. Yahweh controlled the rain, not Baal. Yahweh had answered prayer while Baal remained silent. Yahweh's prophet had demonstrated power while Baal's priests had met their end. But one person remained entirely unconvinced. When news reached Jezebel of her prophet's execution, her response was not doubt or reconsideration, but furious, hardened determination. The battle for Israel's religious soul had only just begun. Jezebel's purge, the once quiet corridors of Samaria, now carried whispers of fear from wall to wall. Jezebel had grown weary of sharing the kingdom with those who followed Yahweh. Her tolerance for religious diversity had dissolved, replaced by a fierce and focused desire to secure her vision for Israel's future. Beneath the warm Mediterranean sun, royal guards moved through villages and towns with lists of names in hand. Those they sought were not common criminals, but prophets, men and women who spoke for Yahweh. The queen had branded them enemies of the crown. Jezebel poured royal resources into new temples across the northern kingdom, their white stone walls rising like declarations of her authority. Inside these sanctuaries, priests of Baal and priestesses of Asher conducted rituals that felt entirely foreign to many Israelites. The smoke from their altars curled upward, mixed with incense, creating a fragrant haze that some found comforting and others found deeply threatening. "The old ways are dying," mothers whispered to their children as they passed these new buildings. "The queen seeks to change everything we have ever known." From her palace in Samaria, Jezebel directed what many would later describe as a purge prophets who refused to acknowledge Baal vanished in the night. Some fled to caves and remote hillsides, surviving on whatever scrap sympathetic villagers could quietly spare. Others were not fortunate enough to escape. Obadiah, a palace official who quietly kept faith in Yahweh, staked everything to shelter 100 prophets in 2 separate caves. He carried them bread and water, moving only under the cover of darkness. His hands trembled every time he passed through the palace gates, afraid that each crossing might be his last. Meanwhile, the queen's reach extended further through the court. Those who coveted royal favor adopted Phoenician customs, dress, and religious practices. They spoke Jezebel's native tongue and hung symbols of Baal inside their homes. Personal ambition became deeply entangled with cultural transformation. Across the countryside, ordinary people made quiet and private choices. Some concealed small altars to Yahweh beneath their floors. Others decided the risk was simply not worth bearing and joined in the new ceremonies. Families fractured along invisible lines of faith. What lifted Jezebel's actions above mere political calculation was the sincerity of her belief. In her own mind, she was bringing enlightenment to a nation she considered behind the times. The gods who had made Phoenicia prosperous and powerful could accomplish the same for Israel. Why would she not offer such a gift to the homeland she had adopted? As the seasons turned, the voice of Yahweh grew fainter across the northern kingdom. Prophets went silent, or spoke only in the shadows. The queen's purge had achieved much of what she intended. For the time being at least, Baal's thunder seemed to swallow Yahweh's whisper. Mount Carmel and the fire. Dark clouds masked above Mount Carmel, perhaps a sign of the confrontation building along its slopes. After years of concealment and silence, one man decided the moment had come for a divine reckoning. Elijah the Tishbite, wild-haired and dressed in leather, sent word to King Ahab, "Meet me on Mount Carmel and bring your prophets with you." The drought had endured 3 years. Fields lay split open and barren. Children went to bed hungry night after night. Even the wealthy felt the pressure of emptied storehouses. Many laid the blame for this suffering at the feet of those who had abandoned Yahweh, and Elijah used that sentiment to set the stage for his challenge. "How long will you waver between 2 opinions?" Elijah called out to the gathered crowd. His voice swept across the mountaintop where hundreds had climbed to watch this contest unfold. "If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him." The people stood in silence, caught between fear of the queen and a quiet, burning curiosity about what might happen next. Ahab watched from beneath the canopy, his face revealing nothing. Messengers had been dispatched to inform Jezebel, but she stayed in the palace, perhaps already sensing something like a trap. Elijah laid out the terms: 2 altars, 2 bulls for sacrifice, but no fire supplied by human hands. Each side would call on their deity to send flame from heaven. The Snorts, God who responded, would be declared the true God of Israel. The prophets of Baal went first. 450 men circled their altar from morning through noon, calling out to their God, "Baal, answer us." As the hours passed with no sign, their movements grew wilder and more desperate. They cut themselves with swords and spears, their blood mixing with sweat on the parched ground. "Perhaps your God is sleeping," Elijah called out to them. "Try louder." His mockery cut deep. But the prophets of Baal pressed on until evening, their voices worn ragged, their bodies exhausted and spent. When the sun began its descent, Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt a ruined altar to Yahweh using 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel. He dug a trench around it. After arranging the wood and placing the offering on top, he called for water. In a land choked by drought, using water in this way seemed almost reckless, even offensive. And yet 4 large jars were poured over the sacrifice, then 4 more, then 4 again, until the trench ran over and could hold no more. As twilight spread across the sky in deep purples and blues, Elijah raised his hands. "Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he prayed, his voice steady and unhurried amid the crackling tension. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel." Fire dropped from heaven, not a flicker or a small glow, but a blaze of such force that it consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones beneath it, and licked clean the water from the trench. The crowd fell to their knees, pressing their faces into the earth. "Yahweh is God," they cried. "Yahweh is God." What followed would leave marks on the kingdom for generations. Elijah, fortified by divine vindication, commanded the seizure of Baal's prophets. 450 men were taken down to the Kishon Valley and put to death. Their blood ran into the dry riverbed, a stark and crimson testimony to religious fervor, pushed to its most violent expression. As, clear as throat, rain clouds finally built on the horizon, riders raced toward Samaria, carrying news that Jezebel would find unthinkable. The religious order she had carefully cultivated had just been overturned by a single prophet and a breathtaking display of divine power. Dawn broke over Samaria and brushed the limestone walls in pale pink. Inside the palace, a storm was already gathering. Jezebel stood without moving as the messenger delivered his report from Mount Carmel. Her priests were dead. Her religion had been publicly disgraced. Her authority had been challenged in front of all Israel. Those who knew the queen well took a careful step back, recognizing the quiet and dangerous stillness that had settled over her. This was not defeat she was feeling. It was rage, cold and calculating, the kind that does not burn hot and then cool, but holds its heat and waits. "So," she said at last, her voice barely lifting above silence, "this prophet believes he has won." She crossed to the window and looked out over the city she had remade in her image. 3 years of drought had ended with Elijah's victory, and rain now fell on her adopted homeland. The people would read this as Yahweh's blessing. Without turning away from the window, she dictated a message to be carried to Elijah immediately. "May the gods deal with me severely, and even more so if by this time tomorrow I have not made your life like the life of one of those slain prophets." This was not simply a threat, but a sacred oath. By calling on the gods, Jezebel bound herself to this course. The messenger went pale at the words, but understood better than to question the queen. Within the hour, riders had left Samaria carrying her sworn promise of vengeance. When Elijah received the message, something entirely unexpected occurred. This was the man who had stood before 450 prophets of Baal, who had called fire down from heaven, who had ordered their execution without a moment's hesitation. And yet this same man now ran. A single woman's oath had achieved what no army had been able to. He fled south beyond the borders of Israel, beyond even the kingdom of Judah, deep into the wilderness. Beneath a broom tree, utterly spent and broken in spirit, he asked for death. "I have had enough, Yahweh," he prayed. "Take my life." Back in Samaria, Jezebel set her network of informants to work. Every road was under watch, every village questioned. She would find the prophet who had humiliated her, who had dismantled years of careful religious and political construction in a single afternoon. For the people of Israel, the conflict had taken on a meaning that ran much deeper. This was not merely a clash between a queen and a wandering prophet. It raised foundational questions about power and truth. Could a queen born in a foreign land impose her will upon an entire nation? Could a lone prophet hold his ground against the full weight of royal authority? Whose God would shape the destiny of Israel? In the courts of neighboring kingdoms, officials spoke in hushed tones about the drama playing out in Israel. Some dismissed it as nothing more than religious squabbling. Others recognized the political implications clearly enough. A monarch whose religious authority had been successfully challenged might soon face questions about the legitimacy of their rule in every other area as well. As days stretched into weeks, Elijah remained in hiding, guided by divine protection, all the way to Mount Horeb, far to the south. There, in the quiet that followed wind and earthquake and fire, he would hear the still small voice that would set the direction of his next steps. Jezebel, for her part, understood that the threat had not passed. Though she had driven Elijah beyond the kingdom's borders, his victory on Mount Carmel had rekindled a genuine and renewed devotion to Yahweh among a great many Israelites. Her oath remained unfulfilled, a debt she fully intended to settle when the moment came. Naboth's vineyard. Just beyond the walls of Jezreel, where the royal family kept their winter palace, a vineyard stretched out, belonging to a man named Naboth. These were not casual vines, but plants tended by the same family across generations, passed from father to son as something sacred and irreplaceable. Ahab had grown fond of this particular piece of land. From his window, he could follow the neat rows of vines, the careful irrigation channels, the dark, rich soil that gave up sweet grapes each season. This land would make a fine vegetable garden, he told himself one afternoon. So close to the palace walls, the king approached Naboth with what he considered a more than fair offer. "Give me your vineyard. I will give you a better one elsewhere, or I will pay whatever price you think fair." But Naboth refused. "Yahweh forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." This was not stubborn pride or greed, for Israelites' ancestral land carried the weight of divine covenant, a physical and spiritual connection to heritage and identity. Parting with it would dishonor both his forebears and his God. Ahab returned to the palace and sulked like a child refused a small pleasure. He lay down on his bed and turned his face to the wall, declining food, stung by a commoner's refusal. When Jezebel discovered him in this state, and learned the reason, she was genuinely baffled by what she saw. "Is this how you conduct yourself as king over Israel?" she asked, her voice heavy with contempt. "Get up and eat something, lift your spirits. I will get you the vineyard." Royal seal in hand, Jezebel composed letters to the elders and nobles of Jezreel. Her plan was executed with chilling precision. Declare a day of fasting, placed Naboth in a seat of prominence among the people, then arranged for two men of no integrity to accuse him falsely of cursing both God and king. The local officials, anxious to curry favor with the queen, followed her instructions without a single question raised. Under the guise of piety and public order, they orchestrated Naboth's ruin. The day came. The accusations were delivered. Witnesses swore to lies. The mood of the gathered crowd turned ugly and dark. No trial, no defense presented, no mercy extended, only stones falling against flesh until Naboth lay still. Word reached the palace quickly. "Naboth is dead." Jezebel delivered the news to her husband with all the calm of someone reporting the weather. "Get up and take possession of the vineyard. Naboth refused to sell it to you. He is no longer alive." Ahab rose from his bed, his sulking forgotten. He made his way down to the vineyard, already perhaps envisioning where he would plant his herbs and vegetables. As he walked the row's neighbor had tended with such care, he did not notice the solitary figure coming toward him from the hillside. Elijah had returned, recalled by divine command, to stand before the king once more. Their meeting among those vines would become one of the most remembered moments in Israel's memory. "Have you found me, my enemy?" Ahab asked, unease, bleeding through his words. "I have found you," the prophet replied, "because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of Yahweh." Then came the pronouncement that would follow the royal couple like a shadow for the rest of their lives. In the very place where dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. And for Jezebel, an even more terrible fate was declared. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. What made this episode so revealing was not only the murder itself, but the method by which it was accomplished. Jezebel had worked entirely within the language and structures of Israelite law and religion. A fast day, a public assembly, the legal requirement of 2 witnesses. She did not simply disregard Yahweh's law. She turned it into a weapon. For many in Israel, Naboth's vineyard became a symbol of royal power, consuming justice. Farmers muttered about it while working their own soil. Elders recounted it in lowered voices as a warning for future generations. Even in the courts of neighboring kingdoms, the story traveled as a cautionary tale about authority left without limits. The prophet returns. 3 years had passed since Elijah's stark confrontation with Ahab in Naboth's vineyard. The prophet had come to move through the kingdom like a shadow, appearing without warning to deliver unwelcome messages and then disappearing again. His name was spoken with equal measures of reverence and dread. Now he returned to find Israel preparing for war. Ben-Hadad of Aram was massing his forces along the northern borders, his armies gathering like clouds before a storm. Ahab, for all his spiritual failings, proved himself a capable military mind as he set about organizing Israel's defenses. In his council room, advisors argued over tactics, while messengers brought fresh intelligence on enemy movements. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a prophet unfamiliar to the court, not Elijah, but one of the many who had begun emerging from hiding. As Jezebel's hold on state affairs gradually loosened, even if her grip on the royal household remained firm. "This is what Yahweh says," the man declared. "Do you see this vast army? I will give it into your hand today, and then you will know that I am Yahweh." Ahab, ever pragmatic even in his idolatry, simply, "By whom?" "By the young officers of the district governors," came the reply. The king followed this unconventional divine strategy, sending 232 junior officers ahead of his army of 7,000. Against every expectation born of military logic, Israel won a decisive victory. Ben-Hadad slipped away on horseback with only a few cavalry, but his forces were broken and scattered across the field. The prophet returned with a word of caution. "Strengthen your defenses and think carefully about what must be done, because when spring arrives, the king of Aram will come for you again." Meanwhile, in Damascus, Ben-Hadad's advisors worked to explain the defeat. "Their gods are gods of the hills. That is why they prove too strong for us. But if we face them out in the open plains, we will surely defeat them." When spring returned, the armies met on the flatlands near Afke. Israel's fighting force looked like 2 small flocks of goats set against the Araman army that seemed to fill the entire landscape. And yet, victory came again to Ahab's forces. 100,000 Araman foot soldiers fell in a single day, and Ben-Hadad surrendered. Rather than order his enemy's execution, Ahab welcomed him as a brother and struck a treaty. Cities taken from Israel would be returned, and Israelite traders would be permitted to operate in the markets of Damascus. To many at the time, this read as shrewd diplomacy, but not to those who spoke for Yahweh. The prophets read this alliance as compromise with what should have been rejected entirely. Another example of Ahab placing political convenience above divine commands. Through a symbolic act, one prophet disguised himself, approached Ahab on the road back from his victory, and confronted him directly. "This is what Yahweh says. You have released a man I had determined must die. Therefore your life for his life, your people for his people." Ahab returned to Samaria sullen and bitter. Victory had turned to something hollow and unsatisfying in his hands. Despite everything his forces had achieved, the king could not shake the shadow of prophetic judgment that seemed to follow every decision he made. For Jezebel, these repeated divine interventions in military affairs only deepened the threat she already faced. The victories attributed to Yahweh gave renewed strength to the very religious faction she had worked so hard to suppress. Her husband found himself increasingly pulled between her counsel and the unrelenting warnings of prophets who kept surfacing despite all her efforts. In the markets and in the villages, people had begun speaking about Yahweh more openly again. They retold stories of the drought of Mount Carmel, of victories won against odds that defied explanation. Something was shifting in Israel, a quiet reawakening of old faith, a growing resistance to Phoenician customs. Elijah observed these developments from a distance, pouring himself into the shaping of a successor named Elisha. The older prophet understood that his own chapter was drawing toward its close. New voices would rise to press the challenge. New confrontations would test the nation at the deepest level. The arrow in the chariot. Word of another approaching war reached the palace in Samaria. This time the threat was not from Aram, but from the growing power of Assyria, pushing in from the east. Ahab, ever the pragmatist, assembled an alliance with his former opponent, Ben-Hadad, and with King Jehoshaphat of Judah to resist this shared danger. Before the armies moved, Jehoshaphat, a man of sincere devotion to Yahweh, asked that they seek divine guidance first. Ahab summoned the 400 prophets who served in his court, men who had learned to season their words with Yahweh's name, while still telling the king what he wanted to hear. "Go," they declared together, "for Yahweh will hand it to the king." But there was an eagerness in their chorus that unsettled Jehoshaphat. "Is there not still a prophet of Yahweh here we can consult?" he asked. Ahab's expression darkened. "There is one more, a man through whom we can seek Yahweh. But I despise him because he never speaks anything good over me. It is always something bad. He is Micaiah son of Imlah." While a messenger went to summon Micaiah, a prophet named Zedekiah fashioned iron horns and strutted about declaring, "With these you will push the Arameans until they are finished." The rest of the court prophets cheered his enthusiasm. The messenger sent to fetch Micaiah advised him to fall in line with the rest, to let his words agree with theirs. His response told everything about the condition of prophetic integrity in those troubled days. "As surely as Yahweh lives, I will speak only what Yahweh tells me," brought before both kings. Micaiah at first repeated the court prophet's message. The tone he used, however, was so clearly laced with sarcasm that Ahab demanded to know, "How many times do I have to make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in Yahweh's name?" Then Micaiah's manner shifted entirely. He described a vision of Yahweh permitting a deceiving spirit to work through the court prophets to lead Ahab forward. His actual message was unmistakable. Disaster was waiting for the king on that battlefield. For delivering this unwelcome truth, Micaiah was struck across the face and thrown into prison. Zedekiah the prophet with iron horns challenged him publicly. "Which direction did the spirit from Yahweh travel when he left me to speak to you?" "You will find out the answer to that," Micaiah replied, "on the day you go looking for a room to hide yourself in," forecasting the reckoning that would come for false prophets when his words proved true. Despite the warning, Ahab prepared for battle in a decision that mixed superstition with strategy. He chose to enter the fighting disguised as an ordinary soldier, while asking Jehoshaphat to wear royal robes. Perhaps he hoped to sidestep not just enemy bowmen, but the judgment the prophet had spoken over him. The battlefield near Ramoth-Gilead became a churning chaos of chariots, horses, and infantry. The king of Aram had issued a standing order to his officers: "Do not engage anyone large or small except the king of Israel." His captains initially gave chase to Jehoshaphat, mistaking him for Ahab, until they realized their error and turned back. Somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, an Aramean soldier drew back his bow without particular aim and released an arrow into the mass of fighting men. That seemingly random shot slid through a gap in Ahab's armor, finding the space between sections of his breastplate. The king remained standing in his chariot, propped upright and facing the Aramean lines as blood gathered in a pool at his feet. By sundown, he was dead. When his body was brought back to Samaria, the servants who washed his blood-soaked chariot did so at a pool where prostitutes bathed. Dogs came and lapped at the water mixed with royal blood. Elijah's prophecy spoken aloud among Naboth's vines, after that vineyard was taken by murder, had arrived at its fulfillment. For Jezebel, Ahab's death marked a sharp turning point. Her standing now rested on her sons rather than on her husband. As Queen Mother, she would retain real and significant influence, especially since her eldest son Ahaziah was cast from much the same mold as his father. Throughout Israel, the news of the king's death and all that surrounded it, the disguise that failed to protect him, the random arrow that found its mark anyway, the dogs lapping up the mingled water and royal blood, all of it seemed to confirm what the prophets had been saying from the beginning. No one, not even a king, steps outside the reach of divine judgment forever. And yet, even as her husband's body was laid in the tomb, Jezebel refused to read these events as anything other than coincidence or the hard fortune of war. Her gods remained powerful in her eyes. Her mission to reshape Israel remained unfinished. The next chapter of her life would be defined not by being a wife, but by being a mother to kings, sons, and thrones. Ahaziah, eldest son of Ahab and Jezebel, took the throne in Samaria amid hushed uncertainty. His reign began while the kingdom was still working through the shock of his father's death. Would the son follow the path the father had walked? The palace watched carefully for early signs of who truly held sway over the new king, and they did not have to wait long. Ahaziah showed clearly and quickly that he was his mother's son, carrying forward the devotion to Baal that had defined his parents' reign. The temples Jezebel had raised remained open and active, their priests still carrying influence. If anything, the young king seemed even more committed to Phoenician religious practice than his father had ever been. For Jezebel, this felt like a restoration of her authority. She was no longer simply the foreign queen brought in to seal a political alliance. She now held the honored position of Queen Mother. From her private rooms, she counsel-ladled her son on matters religious and political alike. Some in the palace claimed no decree left those walls without her approval first. Across the border in Judah, King Jehoshaphat watched these developments with a careful eye. His own kingdom held to the worship of Yahweh, creating a religious and cultural gap between the two sister nations that widened a little more with every passing year. And yet, the practical realities of shared borders and common enemies demanded continued cooperation, regardless of religious differences. Ahaziah's reign turned out to be unexpectedly short. While moving through an upper room of his palace, he fell through a lattice window, suffering injuries that left him bedridden and uncertain of recovery. Racked with pain and afraid for his life, he sent messengers to consult Baal-zebub, god of Ekron, to find out whether he would survive. On the road to Ekron, the messengers were intercepted by Elijah, the aged prophet, his face weathered by long years in desert places. The message he carried was blunt and unsparing. "Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal-zebub? The king will not leave the bed on which he lies. He will certainly die." When the messengers turned back and described the man who had stopped them, Ahaziah knew immediately it was Elijah. Even weakened as he was, the king sent soldiers to bring the prophet in. 2 captains and their 50 men each were consumed by fire from heaven. A third captain approached with his head bowed low, asking humbly for his life and the lives of his men. Elijah then went personally to deliver his message to the dying king. Shortly afterward, Ahaziah died without a son to succeed him, having reigned for only 2 years. The crown passed to his brother Joram, also known as Jehoram. The change of kings created a moment of genuine possibility. Would Jezebel's second son choose a different direction? Those who hoped for change saw early encouraging signs. Scripture records that Joram did what was evil in Yahweh's sight, but not after the manner of his father and mother, for he put away the pillar of Baal that his father had made. This partial reform, clearing away certain Baal symbols while leaving other aspects of foreign worship in place, suggested a man in inner conflict. Perhaps Joram recognized the political wisdom of appeasing Yahweh's followers without fully embracing their faith. Or perhaps he was genuinely searching for a middle way between his mother's devotion and the traditional faith of Israel. For Jezebel, her son's choices likely registered as troubling compromise. The very symbols she had labored to plant throughout the kingdom were now being uprooted by her own child. And yet, she remained influential, adjusting her approach to fit the new realities before her. It was around this time that Elijah's ministry came to its end. In one of the most mysterious moments recorded in all of biblical history, he was carried up into heaven in a whirlwind, witnessed only by his protege Elisha. The mantle of prophetic authority in the most literal sense fell to Elisha, who would carry forward the divine confrontation with Jezebel's enduring influence. Joram's reign brought continued military pressure from outside. Moab, which had paid tribute to Israel, threw off that obligation after Ahab's death. Joram formed a three-way alliance with Jehoshaphat of Judah and the king of Edom to put down the rebellion. When the allied armies found themselves without water deep in the desert, they turned to Elisha. The prophet's response laid bare exactly how he viewed Joram. "What is there between you and me?" he said. "Go to your father's prophets or to your mother's prophets." Only out of deep regard for Jehoshaphat did Elisha relent and offer guidance that saved the allied armies from disaster. The incident made plain the continued spiritual division inside Israel's royal house. Joram stood between two worlds, the Baal worship of his parents and the Yahweh worship Elisha embodied. His position in the middle satisfied neither camp fully and would eventually prove impossible to hold. Throughout these years, Jezebel remained a presence of real weight within the court, though increasingly operating from the background. Her direct authority had shrunk, but her influence flowed quietly through her son and those still loyal to her vision. She watched with growing concern as prophetic power swelled again and pressed once more against the boundaries of royal prerogative. Elijah's legacy and Elisha's rise. A different kind of prophet walked the dusty roads of Israel. Now, where Elijah had been fire and confrontation, meeting kings head-on, Elisha moved more gently among ordinary people. His miracles tended to reach into everyday life, purifying water supplies, stretching food supplies for hungry families, returning breath to the dead. This change in prophetic expression did not reflect reduced power, only power aimed differently. After Elijah's extraordinary departure in the whirlwind, stories about the new prophet spread from village to village. Women whispered of the jar of oil that kept pouring and never ran dry, rescuing a widow from those who would take her children as payment for debts. Farmers told of an axe head that floated on the surface of the water, recovered against every law of nature. Travelers spread word of poisoned stew, made safe and nourishing by a handful of flour. These were not wonders for their own sake. Each one carried a message. Yahweh saw the ordinary person. Yahweh cared about justice and daily struggle, about the lives of those whom the powerful so often overlooked. Perhaps the most consequential of these acts was Elisha's healing of Naaman, commander of Aram's army. This foreign military leader, afflicted with leprosy, found his healing by washing 7 times in the Jordan River, following Elisha's instruction when he had expected something far more dramatic. When Naaman pressed rich gifts on the prophet, Elisha refused them entirely, making clear that divine healing was not a commodity available for purchase. Gehazi, Elisha's own servant, found the offer impossible to resist. He slipped away, approached Naaman privately, claimed that Elisha had reconsidered and would accept a portion of the gift after all. His punishment was to contract the very leprosy from which Ammon had been freed, becoming yet another object lesson about what greed and dishonesty cost in matters of spiritual life. All of these things took place while Jezebel still occupied the palace, working her influence through her son, Joram. The contrast between the two could not have been drawn more sharply. A queen who had deployed royal power to force her religion downward from the throne onto a nation, and a prophet who was building a movement from below, one miracle at a time, one village at a time. In certain respects, Elisha posed an even deeper threat to Jezebel's legacy than Elijah had. Elijah had taken on power directly, producing spectacular moments of confrontation that required only the silencing of one man to potentially quiet. Elisha, by weaving Yahweh worship into the rhythms of common daily life across countless communities, had created a movement far too widely dispersed to be suppressed by any campaign against a single figure. The schools of prophets Elisha established throughout Israel became gathering points of resistance to Baal worship and to the overreach of royal authority. Young men shaped in these communities carried the values and message of Yahweh's covenant into every corner of the kingdom. What had once been a small number of prophets huddled in caves during Jezebel's purge was growing into an organized and resilient spiritual force. Jezebel recognized the threat clearly from her chambers in Samaria and Jezreel. She watched this expanding movement with deepening unease. Her son Joram had already given ground by removing certain Baal symbols. Now, the common people were turning increasingly to Elisha rather than to royal authority for help and direction. Reports reached the palace of the prophet's uncanny awareness of how he could describe in precise detail words spoken in private inside the king of Aram's own chambers, frustrating planned strikes against Israel before they could be launched. One story made its way back to the palace of how the prophet had once been entirely surrounded by enemy forces sent specifically to take him prisoner. When his servant panicked at the sight of the encircling army, Elisha prayed that the young man's eyes would be opened, and he saw the hills around them filled with horses and chariots of fire, a heavenly army beyond counting. This had stopped being only a spiritual contest. It was a struggle for the very heart and future of a nation. Would Israel follow the path of its neighbors with religion defined by royal preference and patronage? Or would the prophetic tradition insisting on justice, compassion, and faithfulness to Yahweh's commands carry the day regardless of what any ruler decreed? Joram found himself pulled between these two visions. His mother represented one road. Elisha represented another. His partial compromise satisfied neither direction fully and left him exposed to pressure from both. For Jezebel, now aged but far from diminished, these years must have carried a particular kind of frustration. The religious transformation she had imagined for Israel had never been completed. Her influence, while still real, faced a prophetic movement that showed no sign of fading or giving in. What neither Jezebel nor Joram yet saw was that Elisha's quiet revolution was about to step directly into the political arena. The prophet, who had spent years performing acts of mercy among ordinary people, was preparing to reach into the very structure of royal power itself. The whisper of revolution. In a quiet space well away from palace informants and the calculations of courtly life, Elisha called aside a young prophet from among his disciples. The room carried the scent of oil and herbs as Elisha placed a small flask into the younger man's hands, its contents unremarkable to the eye, but charged with extraordinary purpose. "Tuck this flask of oil inside your cloak," Elisha instructed, keeping his voice low and steady. "Travel to Ramoth Gilead. When you arrive, find Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi." Jehu was no random selection. A military commander who had served under both Ahab and Joram. He was known throughout the army for his boldness for action that at times bordered on the reckless. "He drives like Jehu," people said of any chariot driver pushing his horses beyond reason. Elisha continued with directions that carried the weight of finality. "Pull him aside from the other officers and take him into an inner room. Pour the oil over his head and say, 'This is what Yahweh declares, I anoint you king over Israel.'" This was not only a religious act, it was an act of treason. Jurah still sat on Israel's throne. To anoint another was to invite civil war, a prospect that seemed not to concern Elisha in the slightest. "Open the door and run immediately," he added, acknowledging in plain terms the danger the young man would be walking into. The young prophet traveled to Ramoth-Gilead, where Israel's army held position against threats from Aram. He found Jehu seated with his fellow officers, perhaps talking strategy or simply passing the slow hours between duties. "I have a word for you, Commander," the young man said. "For which of us?" Jehu asked. "For you, Commander." Inside a private room, the prophet tipped the flask and let the oil run down over Jehu's head, cool against his skin, moving through his beard. "This is what Yahweh, God of Israel, says," the young prophet declared. "I anoint you king over Yahweh's people Israel. You are to strike down the house of Ahab, your master. I will avenge the blood of my servants, the prophets, and the blood of all Yahweh's servants shed by Jezebel." He continued with precise and sobering words about the total destruction of Ahab's entire line, closing with the declaration, reserved specifically for Jezebel. "Dogs will devour Jezebel in the plot of ground at Jezreel, and no one will be left to bury her." His task completed, the young prophet threw open the door and fled, leaving Jehu standing alone with a decision that would reshape everything. Would he accept this divine commission and move against his own king? Or would he dismiss the encounter as the ravings of a madman, as his fellow officers were soon to suggest? When Jehu rejoined his companions, they sensed the change in him immediately. "Why did this crazy person come to you?" they pressed. "You know the kind of talk these people bring." Jehu deflected at first. "You know how it goes with men like that," but they pushed harder. "That is not true. Tell us what happened." Finally, Jehu told them. He said, "This is what Yahweh declares. I anoint you king over Israel." What followed revealed a great deal about how the military class in Israel truly felt about Joram's rule and about Jezebel's lingering shadow over the throne. Rather than reporting this act of treason to their king, the officers recognized Jehu as their new sovereign without a moment's hesitation. They spread their cloaks across the bare steps beneath his feet, creating an improvised royal carpet. A trumpet rang out across the camp, and voices broke out from every direction. "Jehu is king!" The soft murmur of change had already stirred the air. In a remote military outpost, far beyond the watchful gaze of Jezebel, a new ruler had been declared. The oil poured upon Jehu's head barely dried, yet the machinery of fate had already begun rolling toward its violent destination. Jehu moved with the kind of swiftness that defined his nature. "If you truly want me as your king," he told the officers around him, "make sure nobody slips out of this city to carry word to Jezreel." The gates were sealed shut as Jehu readied his chariots for the journey that would reshape Israel forever. Back in the palace at Jezreel, Jezebel and Joram had no sense of the storm drawing near. The uprising beginning at Ramoth-Gilead threatened everything the queen had devoted decades to building. The victory of Yahweh worship, the collapse of her religious ambitions for Israel, and most painfully, a direct blow to the dynasty she had poured her life into creating. The prophetic spark that had first ignited with Elijah would soon grow into a flame that roared across the entire kingdom, bringing reckoning upon the house of Ahab and the queen, who had stood in open defiance of Yahweh. For the moment, however, the secret remained locked among soldiers, readying themselves to march against their own sovereign, Jehu's ride. The royal court of Israel had no warning of what was approaching. Far removed from the palace, a quiet encounter unfolded, one carrying the weight of everything that was to come. Elisha, the prophet who had walked in Elijah's shadow, dispatched a young man carrying a flask of oil to seek out a military commander named Jehu. The young messenger located him seated among his fellow officers. "I have something to tell you, Commander," the young prophet said, drawing Jehu away to a room where they could be alone. There he poured the sacred oil over Jehu's head, marking him as Israel's king to come. The words that followed must have coursed through Zu like cold water. "Thus says the Lord, I anoint you king over Israel. You shall bring down the house of Ahab. I will repay the blood of my servants, the prophets, at the hand of Jezebel." The young man turned and fled the moment those words left his mouth, leaving JW to face his fellow officers and their burning curiosity. When they pressed him about what the fellow had wanted, Jew tried to wave it off, but they pushed harder until he told them the truth. He had been anointed king. In that instant, something changed in the room. These battler-hardened soldiers, recognizing a moment of transformation, stripped off their outer garments and spread them beneath Jew's feet, fashioning a rough royal carpet from cloth and urgency. They raised their trumpets and cried out, "Jehu is king." The coup had taken its first breath, but time was everything now. If word reached Jezreel ahead of Jew, the cause would be lost. Messengers could alert the royal household. Defenses would snap into place. The surprise that gave them their only advantage would dissolve like mist under morning sun. So Jew ordered that no man be allowed to leave with news. Then he mounted his chariot. The reins felt different in his grip. These were now a king's hands, not merely a commander's. The horses caught his urgency and surged forward as he drove hard towards Jezreel, where Jezebel and her son Joram waited without a clue. Scripture tells us the Jew drove furiously. Picture the scene. Great plumes of dust rising in the wake of charging chariots, the drumming of hoofbeats, the groan of wooden wheels spinning at their limits. Jew's face hard as carved stone, his gaze locked on the horizon ahead. This was no ordinary ride. This was destiny launching itself forward at a fearless pace. A watchman stationed on Jezreel's tower spotted the advancing column of chariots on the distant road. First just a cloud of dust, then the unmistakable outline of men and horses pressing forward with clear purpose. King Joram, still laid low by wounds from battle with the Arameans, sent out a rider to meet the oncoming group. "Is it peace?" the rider called out. The familiar greeting of the time, yet carrying enormous tension in that charged moment. Jehu's reply stripped away all pretense. "What peace so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts continue without number?" The messenger did not return. Neither did a second one dispatched by an increasingly anxious king. Both joined Jehu's column instead, adding to the force bearing down on the unsuspecting royal house. The watchman on the tower must have felt dread settling over him as he reported this strange turn to his king. Something had gone deeply wrong, and the dogs of Jezreel began to howl. The fall of Joram. Morning light spread across the walls of Jezreel as two chariots rolled out through the city gates. In one rode King Joram of Israel, Jezebel's son. In the other sat his cousin Ahaziah, king of Judah, who had come to visit his wounded kinsman. Both men, heirs to powerful dynasties, rode side by side to meet the force advancing toward them. They came upon Jehu near the vineyard that had once belonged to Naboth, that very piece of earth that Jezebel had seized through murder and deceit years before. The ground where blood had once soaked the soil now became the site of bloodshed again. History has a particular gift for completing its own circles. "Is it peace?" Joram called out to Jehu, repeating the question his messengers had carried before him. Jehu's answer settled over the moment like smoke before a fire. "What peace so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts continue without number?" In that breath Joram understood everything. "Treachery," he shouted, spinning his chariot to run, but the warning he threw to Ahaziah came a moment too late. Jehu, whose name carries the meaning Yahweh is He, drew back his bow with steady lethal purpose. The arrow flew straight and true, catching Joram between the shoulders and passing through his heart. The king of Israel fell forward in his chariot, his blood pooling beneath him. "Take him and throw him on the field of Naboth," Jehu commanded his officer Bidkar. "Remember how you and I rode together behind his father Ahab, and the Lord spoke this very word against him. Surely I saw yesterday the blood of Naboth and his sons, and I will repay you in this same ground." So Joram's body was cast onto the very land his mother had stolen through corrupt judgment. Justice arrived in a perfect circle that even Jehu himself recognized as something fitting. The ground Jezebel had seized by perverting justice now received the body of her son. King Ahaziah of Judah, having witnessed his cousin's death before his eyes, fled in terror. Jehu's forces gave chase, wounding him in his chariot. Though he managed to reach nearby Megiddo, his wounds proved fatal. The house of Ahab was crumbling one member at a time with Joram dead. Nothing stood between Jew and Jezreel except the city gates and the queen mother, waiting on the other side of them. News of her son's death would reach her soon enough, carried on the same wind, stirring the dust behind Jehu's approaching chariots. The prophetic wheel set into motion long ago by Elijah on the slopes of Mount Carmel was now spinning with terrible momentum. The ground was about to receive more blood, and the dogs of Jezreel grew restless, as though they already sensed the meal that prophecy had promised them. Jezebel's last stand. When word arrived at the palace that Joram was dead, something remarkable unfolded. Jezebel, now an aging queen mother who had weathered decades of political fury, did not run. She did not bury herself in the inner rooms of the palace or cry out for mercy. Instead, she prepared herself for one final act of defiance. She painted her eyes with kohl, the dark cosmetic woven into royal tradition since the days of ancient Egypt. She arranged her hair with care and adorned herself as a queen should be adorned. Some scholars suggest she dressed in her full royal garments, perhaps even the Sidonian priestess regalia she had worn all her life. This was not a vain woman clinging to beauty as death approached. This was a calculated choice. Jezebel had ruled through the power of symbols for decades. Now facing the end of everything, she chose to meet it, not as a frightened woman cowering in shadows, but as a queen, as a priestess, as herself. She took her position at an upper window of the palace, visible to anyone passing through the city gate below. When Jehu's chariot thundered through the entrance of Jezreel, she was ready. Her silhouette appeared in the window above him, regal and unmistakable in her defiance. "Is it peace, you Zimri?" "Murderer of your master," she called down. These were not idle words. They were precisely aimed barbs. By invoking the name Zimri, she drew a comparison between Jehu and a former usurper who had held Israel's throne for only 7 days before meeting a violent end. The message beneath those words was razor clear. "You may take my life, but history will weigh you and find you wanting." Jehu looked upward at this woman who had dominated Israel's political life for so many years, the queen who had come within reach of dismantling Yahweh worship, the foreigner who had planted Baal at the very center of Israel's national life, his nemesis. "Who is on my side? Who?" he shouted upward. The answer came from within the palace itself. 2 or 3 eunuchs, palace attendants who had served the royal household for years, appeared at the window beside Jezebel. Men who had bowed to her command now stood at a crossroads. Remain with a falling queen or step toward the rising power. "Throw her down," Jew ordered. Scripture's account of what followed carries a stark, unadorned weight. So they threw her down. Picture that moment. Hands that had served her for years now gripping her body and releasing her into the air. The queen's voice cut short as she fell. The sound of a human life ending against stone below. Blood spreading across the palace walls and over the wheels of Jehu's chariot. Jehu showed no hesitation. He drove over her body with his chariot, pressing flesh and bone beneath hooves and wheels. Then he walked into the palace to eat and drink, claiming his victory meal in what was now his court. Only after he had satisfied his appetite did a flicker of something almost human show itself. "See now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she is a king's daughter," he said. But when servants went to gather what remained of Jezebel, they found almost nothing: her skull, her feet, and the palms of her hands. The rest had been consumed by the street dogs of Jezreel, Precisely as Elijah had foretold, years before Jezebel's last stand had run its course. Her defiance lingered in an empty window above a blood-stained street, the dogs and the prophecy. Night settled over Jezreel, bringing with it a silence that pressed against the ears. The palace halls where Jezebel's voice had once commanded and shaped events now rang with Jehu's victory celebrations. Outside in the streets, shapes moved through the darkness, the city's hungry dogs drawn forward by the scent of blood. Years before, the prophet Elijah had faced Ahab with fire in his eyes and spoken words that must have seemed almost impossible in that moment. In the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, so shall dogs lick your blood. And about Jezebel, the prophecy had been even sharper in its precision. The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Words spoken in fire had now become events written in flesh and blood. The street dogs of ancient cities were not household pets. They were scavengers, creatures living half-wild at the margins of human settlement, cleaning refuse from the streets and sometimes posing genuine danger to those who moved carelessly at night. Now they had performed their final duty to prophecy, consuming the body of the queen who had once threatened to reduce Elijah himself to the same fate as her slaughtered prophets. When morning arrived, and Jehu's men went to see about burying her, they found what the prophecy had described with unsettling precision. Only her skull remained along with her feet and the palms of her hands, a detail gruesome enough that the biblical text does not soften it. Why exactly those portions survived has occupied scholars for generations. Some propose that the cosmetics and pigments in her hair made the skull less appealing to the animals. The hands and feet, with their tougher skin and diminished flesh, may similarly have been passed over as less appetizing. Whatever the explanation, the partial remains created a final indignity that even death could not spare her. There was simply not enough left of Jezebel to offer a proper burial. When the servants returned and reported what they had found to Jehu, he received the news with a grim nod. "This is the word of the Lord which he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite on the plot of ground at Jezreel. Dogs shall eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the corpse of Jezebel shall be as dung on the face of the open field." The queen who had raised temples and given orders to kings had become food for scavengers, her remains scattered through the city streets. For those who witnessed it, the message was impossible to miss: divine judgment made visible in its most visceral form. For the biblical writers, this ending served as the moral conclusion that Jezebel's story demanded. Her death was not merely a political killing, it was framed as divine justice. The woman who had defied Yahweh lay scattered and unburied, a fate regarded with absolute horror in ancient Near Eastern culture, where proper burial rites carried sacred weight. Yet even within this gruesome conclusion, there is something worth pausing over. Jezebel never ran. She never pleaded. She never abandoned her gods or stepped back from her convictions. She remained wholly herself until the final moment, meeting her end with painted eyes and words designed to cut. The dogs of Jezreel had completed their prophetic role. The blood had been licked from the stones, but Jezebel's story was nowhere near finished. It was only just beginning its long journey through human memory and imagination. The aftershock. Dawn broke over a changed Israel. Jehu, newly declared king, had only just started. The death of Jezebel was no more than an opening act in a brutal campaign to lock down his throne and wipe out every trace of the house of Ahab. Like rings spreading outward from a stone dropped into still water, the consequences of Jezebel's fall were about to reach into every corner of the kingdom. Jehu dispatched letters to Samaria, where 70 sons of Ahab were living under the care of the city's elders. His message came wrapped in false choices. Select the best and most capable of your master's sons, place him on his father's throne, and defend your master's house. It was a trap, and the elders of Samaria understood it immediately. They had watched what happened to Joram and to Jezebel. They replied with total submission, "We are your servants and will carry out whatever you ask. We will place no man on the throne. Do as you see fit." Jahus's second letter exposed his true design. "If you are with me, bring me the heads of your master's sons at Jezreel by this time tomorrow." The following day, 70 baskets arrived at the gates of Jezreel. Each one contained the head of one of Ahab's descendants. Jehu ordered them arranged in 2 stacks at the city entrance, a brutal warning to anyone who might think of contesting his right to rule. But the killing had not run its course. Jehu then eliminated all who remained of Ahab's household, in Jezreel officials, close companions, priests, anyone whose life had been woven into the fabric of the previous dynasty. He then turned towards Samaria, carrying his purge with him along the road. At Beth of the Shepherds, he came upon 42 members of Judah's royal family, kinsmen of the slain King Ahaziah. Though none of them bore any part in Jezebel's crimes, they carried blood ties to Ahab through marriage alliances. Not one of them survived the encounter. Continuing towards Samaria, Jehu crossed paths with Jehonadab, the son of Rehab. Jonadab was a man known for his fierce adherence to ancient traditions and his complete rejection of the comforts and corruptions of city life. Sensing an opportunity to clothe his purge in religious legitimacy, Jehu invited him to ride alongside him. "Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord." With Jehonadab seated beside him, lending a visible veneer of holy approval, Jehu entered Samaria and finished off all who remained of Ahab's extended family. Scripture describes the result with chilling efficiency. He destroyed Ahab in Samaria according to the word of the Lord that he had spoken to Elijah. But Jehu saved his most theatrical violence for the worshippers of Baal, the living remainder of Jezebel's religious legacy. He announced a grand sacrifice to Baal, grander than anything Ahab had ever staged. Worshippers poured in from across Israel, packing Baal's temple until it could hold no more. Once they were all inside, Jehu positioned 80 men around the perimeter of the temple with instructions that left no room for uncertainty. "If any man I am about to hand over to you escapes, you will pay with your life." No sacrifice ever took place. Instead, Jehu's soldiers walked in and cut down every worshipper. They hauled out the sacred pillars and set them on fire. They pulled down the temple itself and converted it into a latrine, the ultimate gesture of contempt and desecration. In one swift and coordinated campaign, Jehu had erased both the dynastic and the religious inheritance that Jezebel had spent her life building. The Omride dynasty that had governed Israel for decades no longer existed. The Baal worship she had brought into Israel's heart was driven underground. The temples she had erected were rubble. The biblical writers approved of Jehu's religious purging while keeping silent about his methods. The authors of Kings record that God told Jehu, "Because you have done well in carrying out what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab all that was in my heart, your sons to the 4th generation shall sit on the throne of Israel." Yet later prophets such as Hosea would speak out against the bloodshed of Jezreel, suggesting that even purposes aligned with the divine did not entirely justify the excess of Jehu's violence. The aftershocks of Jezebel's fall had grown into a full political earthquake, leaving Israel's landscape transformed beyond recognition. Jezebel through the prophets. Long after the dogs had finished their grim work in the streets of Jezreel, Jezebel continued to live in Israel's collective memory. The prophets who came after Elijah and Elisha kept her story breathing, not simply as a record of historical events, but as a potent symbol that carried meaning beyond the woman herself. Through their writings, Jezebel outlasted her own death, becoming something larger than her story. A warning woven into the tradition, a spiritual archetype, a name whose weight extended far beyond any single life. Hosea, writing roughly a century after Jezebel's death, called up the memory of Jezreel's bloodshed when pronouncing judgment upon Jehu's dynasty. Though he never called her by name, His words kept that violent chapter alive for generations who had not witnessed it. In the writings of Jeremiah, false prophets are condemned, using language that would have called Jezebel's imported priests and prophets immediately to mind for any listener who knew their history. When Jeremiah warned against those who prophesy by Baal and lead my people astray, the echo of Jezebel's religious establishment would have been unmistakable. Ezekiel deployed some of his most vivid and searching language to condemn religious infidelity, often drawing on feminine imagery that summoned the memory of Jezebel's story. When he spoke of Israel straying after foreign gods, his audience would have known exactly who had paved that road. But it was in the much later book of Revelation that Jezebel made her most direct and named prophetic appearance. In a letter addressed to the church at Thyatira, the risen Christ condemns that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and misleading my servants to practice immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. This was not the historical Jezebel who had been gone for nearly 1,000 years when Revelation was composed. It was rather someone within the early Christian community whose teachings were seen as equally corrupting in their effect. By reaching back to Jezebel's name, the author drew on centuries of layered meaning, foreign influence, false teaching, seduction away from true devotion. Through the prophets, Jezebel grew into something beyond a failed queen. She became the symbol of religious corruption, of the corrosive pull of outside influence, of feminine power deployed to lead the faithful down a wrong road. Her name became a shorthand for a category of spiritual danger that the biblical writers returned to again and again. Whether this characterization was just to the actual woman is a separate question entirely. The prophets were not composing objective history. They were shaping spiritual narrative, crafting lessons their communities needed to hear. Jezebel fit their purposes with perfect precision. Powerful, foreign, feminine, and devoted to gods they rejected. Yet, even in the prophetic writings, traces of Jezebel's genuine power show through. She is never portrayed as ineffective or weak. She is dangerous precisely because she is capable, determined, and difficult to stop. The prophets condemned her with such force because she came terrifyingly close to succeeding in reshaping Israel's religious identity permanently. In the prophetic imagination, Jezebel expanded beyond the scale of any single life. She came to represent a recurring pattern they warned against repeatedly: the seductive pull of foreign ways, the corrupting reach of power cut loose from proper worship, the danger of forgetting one's spiritual foundations. This prophetic afterlife ensured that she would never fade quietly from memory. Long after her contemporaries had become nothing more than names in old genealogies, hers continued to spark strong reactions. The prophets had taken a Sidonian princess and turned her into an eternal symbol, guaranteeing that as long as their texts were read, Jezebel would go on living. Was Jezebel a feminist icon? Under wide desert skies, ancient stories take on new shapes with every generation that retells them. As contemporary eyes look back across 3,000 years to the figure of Jezebel, something curious begins to happen. The biblical narrative's villain sometimes shifts into something quite different: a feminist icon, a misunderstood woman of power, a victim of the stories told about her by those who opposed her. Is there genuine truth in this kind of reinterpretation? The answer resists simplicity. Jezebel undeniably displayed qualities that modern feminists might find worthy of respect. She was forceful in a world where women rarely held direct authority. She preserved her cultural and religious identity rather than surrendering it to fit into her adopted country's expectations. She exercised real political power, not merely ceremonial influence, and when death came for her, she faced it with dignity and defiance rather than pleading or disappearing into hiding. These qualities, independence, cultural integrity, political intelligence, and courage, resonate with values that contemporary readers associate with genuine female empowerment. Some modern eyes, looking back at Jezebel, see a woman who refused to be pushed to the margins, who found ways to occupy real space in a world built to keep her out. Yet claiming Jezebel as a straightforward feminist hero requires setting aside the darker charges the biblical text levels against her. The narrative accuses her of engineering Naboth's judicial murder to satisfy her husband's desire for a neighbor's land. It describes her violent campaign against Yahweh's prophets. It portrays her as importing religious practices that, by biblical standards, led Israel into serious error. A more carefully considered feminist reading might acknowledge these portrayals while raising honest questions about the reliability of the account itself. After all, Jezebel's story comes to us entirely through writers who stood in fundamental opposition to everything she represented, both religiously and politically. They had every incentive to paint her in the darkest colors available to them. What would her reign look like if the account had come from Sidon? What if we had records left by the women who served in her court or by those who worshipped at the temples she built and funded? Those voices have been lost entirely, leaving behind a portrait drawn exclusively by her enemies. Some scholars have pointed out that the biblical text's attention to Jezebel's cosmetics and physical presentation in her final scene reveals the weight of ancient biases. Would a male ruler's last moments have been described with such focus on his appearance? Or would the record have stayed fixed on his political and military conduct? Perhaps the most balanced view refuses to place Jezebel in either category. Neither full villain nor uncomplicated hero, but a complex human being navigating circumstances not entirely of her own making. Born a princess in coastal Phoenicia, she was dispatched to a less cosmopolitan and far more religiously rigid kingdom as a piece on a political board. She carried her cultural heritage with her, including religious practices that horrified the religious establishment of her new home. Rather than quietly assimilating, she moved to transform the place she had been sent to. That choice, whether it is understood as courageous or as reckless, set her on a course of direct collision with prophetic forces that would not bend. Modern feminist interpretation does not need to restore Jezebel to perfection in order to find real value in her story. Perhaps what is most genuinely feminist about engaging with her is simply the act of seeing her as a fully human participant in the events of her time. Neither a demon nor a saint, but a woman making choices within the possibilities and the walls of her particular historical moment. Her story reminds us that women have always found paths to power, even within societies that appear designed to prevent it. It shows us that ancient texts often reveal as much about their writers' assumptions and fears as they do about their stated subjects. And it demonstrates how religious conflict has a way of becoming the lens through which history judges figures whose real complexity refuses to be contained. Jezebel as a straightforward feminist icon, perhaps not entirely, but Jezebel as a woman worth understanding on her own terms beyond the caricature her opponents constructed. Absolutely. The politics of idolatry, a soft wind moving through cedar trees, the warm glow of oil lamps falling across stone pillars, sweet incense curling upward toward carved wooden ceilings. This was the world of Baal worship, not the scene of demonic excess so often conjured in the imagination, but a sophisticated religious tradition with centuries of accumulated practice and meaning behind it. To understand Jezebel with any real depth, we need to look past the biblical condemnation and consider what her religious tradition actually consisted of. Archaeological discoveries have given us a picture of Phoenician religion that is considerably more nuanced than what the biblical writers chose to provide. Baal, whose name simply translated as Lord or Master, was a god of storms and fertility. In agricultural societies where everything depended on rainfall and the turning of seasons, devotion to him was entirely understandable. Carvings and statues recovered from the region show him holding a lightning bolt or raised spear, symbols of his authority over the life-giving rains. His consort Asherah, also referenced in biblical texts, was associated with fertility and motherhood. These were not uniquely Phoenician deities. Various expressions of Baal worship extended across the ancient Near East. Even within Israel itself, archaeological evidence suggests that many ordinary people practiced a blended faith that wove elements of Baal devotion in alongside worship of Yahweh. The boundaries between religions were often considerably more fluid in lived experience than biblical texts acknowledge. What made Jezebel's version of these practices so dangerous in the eyes of her opponents was not necessarily their content in isolation, but the context in which she introduced them. She was not simply practicing private devotion. She was implementing state-sponsored religious change on a national scale. She built temples using royal funds. She supported hundreds of prophets and priests directly out of the palace treasury. She elevated her gods to a position of national prominence. This was not simply religion, it was inseparable from politics. In the understanding of the ancient Near East, gods and kingship were bound together in ways that could not be separated. Kings ruled by divine sanction. Temple and palace functioned as parallel centers of authority. By reshaping Israel's religious landscape, Jezebel was simultaneously reshaping its political foundations. For the Yahwistic prophets like Elijah, this amounted to an existential crisis. Their understanding of Israel's identity was built entirely on exclusive devotion to Yahweh. Their understanding of kingship depended on the monarch's accountability to divine law rather than the monarch's embodiment of divine will. Jezebel's religious program threatened both of these foundations at their roots. The conflict between Jezebel and Elijah was never simply a theological disagreement conducted in polite terms. It was a contest for Israel's soul and its future. Would the northern kingdom hold on to its distinctive religious character, or would it be absorbed into the broader patterns of its regional neighbors? Would its monarchy follow the model of other Near Eastern divine kingships? Or would it remain answerable to prophetic voices claiming to speak for Yahweh alone? Archaeological work at Samaria brings the material reality of Jezebel's reign into clearer focus. Ivory carvings displaying Egyptian and Phoenician motifs, pottery bearing distinctively Phoenician designs, the remnants of monumental architecture carrying Sidonian influence. These recovered objects confirm the biblical image of a royal court that embraced outside cultural elements wholeheartedly. But was Jezebel a religious hardliner intent on obliterating Yahweh worship, as the biblical narrative implies? Or was she a builder of cultural bridges, seeking to draw Israel into fuller participation in the broader Mediterranean world? The truth likely lives somewhere between those two portraits. As a Sidonian princess, Jezebel would have grown up in a cosmopolitan trading city, long accustomed to religious plurality. Phoenician ports welcomed merchants from across the Mediterranean, each arriving with their own gods and rituals. From that perspective, adding Baal and Asherah to Israel's religious life might have looked to her like practical cultural diplomacy rather than aggressive religious conquest. However, Israel's prophetic tradition had long pushed back against exactly this kind of accommodation. From Moses forward, prophetic voices had insisted on undivided devotion to Yahweh. What appeared to Jezebel as a harmless and even natural religious expansion looked to them like a catastrophic compromise. The politics of idolatry in Jezebel's era reveals something that continues to be relevant in religious conflicts throughout history. What appears on the surface to be purely theological disagreement nearly always carries beneath it deeper struggles over cultural identity, political authority, and how a community understands itself and its boundaries. Jezebel's religious program threatened not just Israel's worship practices, but its sense of being a people with a particular calling. In the end, the prophets carried this particular contest. Jehush's purge removed official Baal worship from Israel's landscape, Yet archaeological evidence suggests that popular religious practice in the daily lives of ordinary people remained blended for a long time afterward. The tension between official orthodoxy and the way people actually lived, their faith never fully resolved, a pattern that has repeated itself throughout religious history in every tradition. Women in power in the ancient Near East, the fading sun threw long shadows across the painted walls of royal chambers in Memphis, Hattusa, Nineveh, and Tyre. In these ancient capitals, women moved through corridors of influence, finding their paths to power in societies that appeared designed to keep them out. Jezebel was not an outlier in the ancient world. She was part of a long and substantial tradition of women rulers who shaped history from behind thrones or on occasion directly upon them. In Egypt, women like Hatshepsut did not merely influence kings. They became kings ruling not in the title of queen consort, but as female pharaohs. Hatshepsut adopted the full visual language of male royal authority, including the ceremonial false beard in official depictions. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari stands to this day as a testament to a 200-year reign that preceded Jezebel's time by nearly 1,000 years. Closer to Jezebel's own era, the Assyrian queen Shammur-Ramat, known to the Greeks as Semiramis, served as regent for her son and led military campaigns in her own right. Archaeological evidence confirms her exceptional standing. Her name appears on inscriptions normally reserved for kings. Like Jezebel, the legends surrounding her grew more elaborate with each retelling, eventually transforming a historical ruler into a figure of mythic proportions. In Hittite civilization, the queen held the formal title of Tawananna and maintained her position even after her husband's death, continuing to serve alongside the successor king. These women conducted diplomatic correspondence with other royal courts and held critical religious functions as chief priestesses. Set against this backdrop, Jezebel's exercise of power looks considerably less extraordinary. As the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon and priest of Astarte, she would have grown up watching the interlocking of political and religious authority as a matter of ordinary royal life. When she married into Israel's royal house, she brought those expectations with her as a matter of course. The Mediterranean world that Jezebel knew was moving through what historians call the Orientalizing period, a time of intensifying cultural exchange between East and West. Trade networks were carrying not only goods, but ideas, practices, and artistic forms across what had previously been more fixed boundaries. Royal women often traveled between courts as diplomatic marriages bound political alliances together. Foreign princesses like Jezebel carried their cultural and religious identities with them wherever those alliances sent them. The biblical writers interpreted Jezebel's exercise of power through a particular filter, reading her influence as corruption rather than as culturally familiar queenship. Yet her methods, patronage of religious officials, strategic court appointments, the cultivation of marriage alliances for her children were standard tools for royal women across the region. What set Jezebel apart was not the way she exercised power, but the specific environment in which she exercised it. Israel's religious and political tradition diverged from its neighbors in fundamental ways. Prophets like Elijah claimed a form of divine authority that stood entirely separate from, and at times, in direct opposition to royal power. This created immediate friction when Jezebel applied patterns of queenship that were entirely unremarkable in Phoenicia to Israel's far more volatile setting. After Jezebel's death, her daughter Athaliah extended the family's tradition of female authority into the following generation. When her son, King Ahaziah of Judah, died, Athaliah seized the throne outright and ruled Judah for 6 years on her own authority. Like her mother before her, she met a violent end when priests organized a coup to restore her grandson Joash to the throne. These mother and daughter rulers together demonstrate how women could create enduring spaces for female authority even within rigidly patriarchal systems. They used religious patronage, control over the royal household, strategic marriages, and the careful building of loyal networks to construct systems of influence that sometimes matched or surpassed those of the kings they had married. Archaeological evidence recovered from across the ancient Near East confirms that royal women controlled their own households, managed substantial property holdings, conducted business affairs, and in some cases administered entire regions or cities. Seals bearing queens' names have been recovered, establishing that these women held authority to conduct official transactions. Jezebel's story, placed within this broader context, becomes less the tale of one woman's singular ambition and more the inevitable friction produced when different models of female royal authority collided with Israel's distinctly different religious and political norms. The biblical writers presented Jezebel as a dangerous exception, but by the standards of the world she had been born into, she was doing what Sidonian queens did. Her tragedy was not that she reached for power, it was that she never fully grasped how differently power worked in the kingdom she had entered. Centuries after her death, her name became the standard shorthand for dangerous female influence. Yet in her own time, she was walking paths that had been walked by royal women before her. The ancient Near East produced many powerful women whose stories have faded from the record over time. Jezebel survives not because she was unique, but because her enemies wrote her story with enough force and vividness to carry it across 3,000 years. Jezebel in Jewish tradition. Stars flicker above ancient synagogues, where for centuries rabbis and scholars have unrolled Torah scrolls and turned over their meanings with careful hands. In those houses of learning, Jezebel's story continued to grow and develop long after her death. Jewish tradition found in her a compelling symbol and a useful moral lesson. A woman whose story could be opened and examined for what it taught about faith, cultural loyalty, and the proper conduct of a life. The earliest post-biblical Jewish interpretations of Jezebel appear in the Talmud, that vast body of rabbinic deliberation compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries of the Common Era. Here the rabbis fill in the spaces the biblical narrative leaves open, pressing into questions the text does not fully answer. One well-known Talmudic passage takes up the question of why Jezebel deserved the particular death she received. The rabbis, always searching for patterns of measure, for measure justice in the biblical stories, suggested that her gruesome end, being consumed by dogs, corresponded to specific transgressions. According to one opinion in these discussions, she would dance before young men in ways that seduced them, using the jingling sound of ankle bells, like those worn by temple dancers. This interpretation reshaped the political and religious conflict of the biblical account into a story centered on sexual impropriety. Another rabbinic tradition lingers over Jezebel's name itself. In Hebrew, the name Jezebel was read to contain roots pointing toward both where is and dung. The rabbinic wordplay around the name Zevel suggested that her name had foreshadowed her fate. She would end as dung scattered across an open field, as the prophet had declared. The great medieval commentators continued developing Jezebel's image for their own generations. Rashi, the celebrated 11th century French scholar, noted that when scripture says Jezebel painted her eyes, the Hebrew phrasing implies that she did so to increase her beauty, which Rashi read as an indication of vanity. Persisting, even. Yet other commentators interpreted her final actions differently, suggesting she adorned herself not from vanity, but out of a resolve to die with the dignity belonging to her rank and station. In the mystical tradition of Kabbalah, Jezebel sometimes appears as a symbol of the Sitra Achra, the other side or the forces of spiritual impurity. Her foreign gods and her persecution of prophets made her an apt embodiment of opposition to holiness. Jewish ethical literature, The Musar tradition used Jezebel as an example of how power exercised without proper spiritual grounding leads inevitably toward corruption. These texts frequently set her against the virtuous women of the Bible, such as Sarah, Rebecca, or Esther, women who used their influence to serve and protect their people, rather than to work against the divine will. Perhaps what is most striking is the way Jewish tradition maintained a kind of genuine ambivalence about Jezebel. While never clearing her name or rehabilitating her character, rabbinic sources occasionally acknowledged qualities in her that were not entirely without value. The Talmud observes at one point that part of the reason Ahab was granted 22 years of kingship was that he respected his wife and his Torah, which contains 22 letters. Even in condemning what Jezebel represented, this tradition recognized that honoring one's spouse was itself praiseworthy. Some midrashic traditions suggest that Jezebel's fidelity to the religious traditions of her childhood, however misguided in the rabbinic view, demonstrated a certain integrity of character. She remained true to the faith she had been born into, rather than adopting her husband's religion as a political convenience. This consistency, even when directed toward what the rabbis regarded as false gods, carried within it a seed of the kind of faithfulness that was genuinely admirable. Heretic teachers occasionally extracted deeper lessons from Jezebel's story. One interpretation suggested that her name containing the word Zevul, meaning dwelling, hinted at how even the most spiritually diminished states might become dwelling places for divine presence through genuine tshuah or repentance. Though the biblical account offers no indication that Jezebel herself repented, her story could serve to inspire in others the turning that she never made. As Jewish communities moved through their own histories of persecution and mounting pressure to assimilate into surrounding cultures, Jezebel's story took on dimensions that resonated with their immediate experience. In medieval and early modern Europe, Jewish commentators sometimes recognized in Jezebel's imported religious practices a mirror for the temptations their own communities faced to abandon tradition in favor of the dominant surrounding culture. For Jewish women across the centuries, Jezebel stood as a warning about the misuse of influence. Yet, as women's roles evolved within modern Jewish movements, some began to ask whether Jezebel's portrayal reflected genuine moral failings, or whether it reflected instead a kind of institutional discomfort with female authority. Contemporary feminist Jewish scholars have examined carefully how gender shaped both the biblical and the rabbinic portrayal of Jezebel, trying to separate whatever historical reality might lie beneath from the gendered narrative constructed over it. Throughout all these varied readings, Jewish tradition maintained Jezebel as a figure of genuine complexity, never simply brushed aside, always worth reopening for deeper examination. Her story became a kind of mirror in which each generation could look and find its own questions about assimilation, religious integrity, the proper use of power, and the complicated position of women within religious communities. In synagogues and houses of study, whenever Torah scrolls were unrolled to the accounts of Israel's kings, Jezebel's name continued to produce strong responses, a lasting testimony to her power as a symbol in Jewish religious imagination. Jezebel in Christian imagination. The name Jezebel moves through Christian history like a warning struck on a bell. In the book of Revelation, composed centuries after her death, she is no longer flesh and blood, but something more unsettling. The author refers to a prophetess who calls herself Jezebel, teaching and leading her followers off course. With that single reference, her name vaults from the realm of history into the realm of spiritual metaphor. Medieval Christians did not simply remember Jezebel. They were wary of what she was understood to represent. Monks copying manuscripts would sometimes stop at her name and make the sign of the cross before continuing their work. In their understanding, she was not merely a queen long dead, but a lurking force, a spiritual hazard capable of appearing in any woman who overstepped her designated place. By the time of the witch trials in Europe, Jezebel had become a standard label attached to women who challenged authority in any form. Preachers invoked her from their pulpits, holding up her painted face and her haughty stare at the window as evidence of the dangers of female vanity and resistance. A woman who was considered too bold or too vocal might find herself measured against this ancient queen with all the danger such a comparison carried with it. Protestant reformers found new purposes for Jezebel's story in their own time. When Martin Luther turned his full force against the Catholic Church, he called the papacy worse than any Jezebel. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, wrote his famous tract, The First Blast of the Trumpet against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, targeting Mary Queen of Scots, by drawing an explicit comparison to the Phoenician queen who had led Israel into religious error. The concept of a Jezebel spirit took root in the soil of American revivalist movements and grew vigorously there. Preachers described this spirit as one that seeks to undermine men, particularly those holding positions of spiritual leadership. They warned their congregations to stay alert for its signs, patterns of dominance, manipulation, and seduction, all bound together in the image of a painted queen posing at her window. Camp meetings stretching across America's frontier featured passionate sermons about Jezebel's influence hiding in the open undetected. Women who wore too much jewelry or who spoke with too much confidence might be gently drawn aside for correction. The fear behind it was not simply the fear of female power, but something that ran deeper. The fear that genuine faith could be corroded from within by a corruption too subtle to see clearly. Contemporary evangelical literature extends this tradition, with books devoted to overcoming the Jezebel spirit occupying space on church bookstore shelves. These works tend to blend the biblical account with concepts drawn from spiritual warfare, producing a Jezebel far more supernatural in nature than anything described in the books of Kings. She becomes less a historical person and more a timeless spiritual archetype, the feminine face of defiance against divine order. In Christian art across the centuries, Jezebel appears at her window, frozen forever in that last moment before her fall. Medieval illuminated manuscripts render her tiny and distant, while Renaissance painters linger over the moral contrast, setting her beauty and finery against the violence that is about to erupt. Her painted face becomes a mask, and what Christianity has long warned lies behind such masks is darkness. Contemporary Christian films and novels still reach for Jezebel when they need a source of dramatic and moral tension. They tend to position her in direct opposition to Elijah, building a contest between feminine manipulation and masculine prophecy, between human scheming and divine truth. These modern versions typically smooth away the political complexity of her actual historical situation, concentrating instead on the moral lesson that her destruction is meant to provide. Yet even within Christianity, new voices have begun to push against this long tradition. Female theologians have started re-examining Jezebel's story, asking honestly how much of her status as a villain owes to the fact that her account was shaped entirely by those who wanted her destroyed. They ask what portions of her story might read in a completely different light if the telling had originated with her rather than with those who celebrated her ruin. Jezebel in Islam and the Quran. Unlike many figures from the biblical world who find their way into Islamic texts, Jezebel is conspicuously absent from the Quran. That silence itself says something. Where figures like Solomon, David, and Moses appear as bridges connecting the traditions, Jezebel remains entirely within Jewish and Christian narrative. Her story finds no home in Islamic scripture. This absence creates a fascinating void. Islamic tradition honors many prophets that it shares with Judaism and Christianity, but it records nothing of Elijah's confrontation with Jezebel. The dramatic showdown at Mount Carmel, which stands at the center of the biblical account, simply does not exist in Islamic telling. The focus falls on his calling his people back to the worship of the one true God, and the royal adversary who opposed him goes unnamed and unrecorded. Had Jezebel found her way into Islamic texts, she might have taken her place among other women known for opposing prophets, figures such as Pharaoh's wife, who rejected Moses, or the wife of Abu Lahab, who strewed thorns in Muhammad's path. Instead, she remains entirely unknown to traditional Islamic teaching. When Muslim scholars examine biblical narratives not included in the Quran, they often explain these omissions as either corrections to corrupted accounts or as reflections of divine wisdom in selecting which stories are most necessary for faith. Though unnamed in Islamic scripture, echoes of her archetypal role, the powerful woman opposing God's messenger, do surface in Islamic folk traditions. Stories passing through those traditions warn of women using beauty and social influence to draw men away from righteous living. These cautionary narratives share thematic ground with Jezebel's story without borrowing directly from it. In regions where Christianity and Islam have existed alongside each other for long periods, the kind of cultural exchange that happens between neighboring communities has sometimes carried knowledge of Jezebel into Muslim communities. Parts of Lebanon, Turkey, and Egypt carry folk traditions that touch on her, blending her story with local material until the biblical specificity fades. She becomes simply a queen who defied God and came to a terrible end. Modern Muslim historians, approaching the Bible from a critical and scholarly standpoint, sometimes mention Jezebel when they are examining the northern kingdom of Israel. They treat her as a historical figure rather than as a spiritual example, noting the political complexities of her era and the cultural collision that her marriage to Ahab represented. These scholarly engagements view her through a lens of historical analysis rather than moral instruction. The absence of Jezebel from Islamic tradition creates an instructive point of comparison between the different ways religious traditions handle the same available material. Where Christianity transformed her into an ongoing spiritual threat, a timeless symbol of temptation and corruption, Islam simply moved past her. This difference illuminates how traditions select certain narratives and amplify them, while allowing others to recede quietly from collective memory. For Muslims living in Western countries today, Jezebel frequently represents an unfamiliar reference point in the vocabulary of their Christian neighbors. When they encounter her name being used as shorthand for a manipulative or dangerously seductive woman, the biblical context behind that usage may be entirely foreign to them. The name carries no accumulated weight, no layered history, no significance at all, which stands in sharp contrast to the loaded meaning it carries in Christian discourse. This absence also means that Muslim women have been spared one specific avenue of religious criticism. No Muslim woman, regardless of how much power she holds or how controversial her choices, has ever had to carry the burden of being compared to Jezebel. The name could never be turned into a weapon against them, the way it had been wielded against women in Christian contexts across so many generations. Perhaps what is most fascinating is how this entire situation reveals the deeply selective nature of sacred memory. Three faiths that share so many of the same stories and figures can diverge so completely when it comes to others. Jezebel, prominent enough to fill dozens of verses in the Hebrew Bible, powerful enough to stand against prophets and kings, simply disappears from the spiritual map the moment one steps from Christian tradition into Islamic understanding. Archaeology of Samaria and Jezreel. The spade uncovers what texts keep hidden. When archaeologists first broke ground at ancient Samaria in the early 1900s, they were not simply digging for pottery shards. They were searching for Jezebel's world. What they uncovered changed her from a villain in ancient writings into a woman who walked real streets and inhabited real palaces whose foundations remain standing to this day. Samaria sits atop a hill, looking out over fertile valleys below. Its natural defensive position made it an ideal location for a capital city, and excavations brought to light massive stone walls dating back to the era of Omri and Ahab, Jezebel's father-in-law and husband, respectively. These were not rough or primitive fortifications. They were sophisticated constructions using ashlar masonry, finely carved stone blocks that speak of both wealth and technical skill. The biblical writer who recorded that Ahab built an ivory house was not exaggerating. Among the most breathtaking discoveries were delicate ivory pieces, hundreds of them adorning furniture and walls throughout the palace area. These ivories display unmistakable Phoenician craftsmanship, combined with Egyptian motifs including lotus flowers, sphinxes, and royal figures seated on thrones. Many scholars believe Jezebel brought these artistic influences with her from Tyre. A person could trace the same curves and patterns that her own eyes once admired. A stone seal discovered in Israel carries the inscription YZBL, quite possibly Jezebel's personal seal for use on official documents. Its existence confirms something that is often overlooked. She functioned as a legitimate queen with genuine administrative responsibilities, not merely as the biblical villain history reduced her to. The seal itself shows Egyptian influence in its design, again pointing to the cosmopolitan character of her court. The archaeological layers tell a story of prosperity during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel. Imported goods, Cryot pottery, Egyptian scarabs, luxury items from across the Mediterranean, all point to a kingdom deeply embedded in flourishing trade networks. Far from driving Israel toward ruin, the material evidence strongly suggests that their reign was marked by economic growth and cultural exchange. At Jezreel, the site of Jezebel's death, excavations revealed an enormous rectangular enclosure with massive corner towers. This royal compound corresponds closely to the biblical description of a secondary palace where the royal couple sometimes took up residence. Standing at the excavated gate, one can almost picture Jew's chariot approaching and Jezebel positioned at her window above. The religious conflict that sits at the center of Jezebel's story also leaves traces in the ground. Archaeologists have uncovered small female figurines, possibly representations of Asher, the goddess frequently worshipped alongside Baal. These were found not only in royal contexts, but inside ordinary households, suggesting that the religious practices Jezebel promoted had already taken root among the broader population. Stone altars with corners matching the biblical description of Baal worship sites have also been excavated. Of deliberate destruction, possibly carried out during the religious reforms that followed Jezebel's death. These broken stones bear silent witness to the violent religious reversals the population endured as royal policy shifted back and forth. Water systems from this period demonstrate remarkable engineering capability. Deep shafts were cut through solid bedrock to reach springs beneath the cities, securing water supplies during times of siege. The impressive waterworks at Megiddo and Hazor likely mirrored those in Samaria, demonstrating that whatever one may say of her religious policies, Jezebel's kingdom invested seriously in critical infrastructure. Climate studies of the region have identified evidence of a severe drought during the 9th century BCE, precisely the period when the Bible places Elijah's confrontation with the prophets of Baal over which deity could bring the drought to an end. This scientific confirmation of a genuine climate crisis lends credibility to the biblical account, suggesting it preserves memory of real historical events. However, filtered through theological interpretation, no archaeological evidence directly confirms the more graphic details of Jezebel's death. No dog bones gathered at a particular location in Jezreel, no bloodstains on ancient stones. Yet, the spatial layout of the excavated palace aligns with the biblical description of her defenestration. The physical setting makes the story plausible in ways that pure fiction might not be. Perhaps most significantly, archaeology reveals what texts only hint at. Jezebel lived in a multicultural kingdom where Israelite traditions blended fluidly with Phoenician, Egyptian, and Canaanite influences. The material culture does not show rigid separations between belief systems, but rather a continuous interchange of ideas, art forms, and practices. This broader context helps explain why her introduction of Phoenician worship was not nearly as foreign or as shocking as biblical writers later made it seem. When you hold artifacts from her era, a pottery shard, a stone weight, a fragment of carved ivory, you are touching her world directly. These objects bridge thousands of years, connecting us to a queen who was never permitted to tell her own story, yet whose presence remains embedded in the very soil of Israel. The name that once belonged to her was sharpened into a blade across centuries and pressed against the throats of countless women. Jezebel, once simply the name of a Phoenician princess, was transformed into one of history's most potent insults. Few names have traveled so far from their origins or cut so deeply when spoken aloud. In colonial America, white slave owners twisted Jezebel's story into a racial weapon. They applied the label of Jezebel to enslaved black women, painting them as inherently seductive and morally corrupt. This deliberately constructed stereotype cast victims as temptresses, justifying sexual violence by placing blame on those who suffered it. The cruel irony is difficult to overstate. Jezebel, a powerful queen, was converted into a tool for further disempowering society's most vulnerable people. The Jezebel stereotype poisoned American race relations for generations. It allowed white society to view black women as inherently different, more sexual, less virtuous, and undeserving of the protections extended to white women. In courtrooms, a black woman claiming sexual assault might encounter whispers of Jezebel, her very humanity called into question through association with an ancient queen she had never worshipped. Meanwhile, suffragists fighting for women's right to vote found themselves compared to Jezebel by those who opposed them. Political cartoons depicted them with painted faces and haughty expressions, deliberately echoing the biblical queen's final moments. The message was unmistakable. Women who sought political power would end up as she did, rejected, destroyed, and remembered only as cautionary tales. During the temperance movement, women who advocated against alcohol were both compared to Jezebel and used her name against so-called fallen women. The bitter irony went largely unnoticed. Those wielding her name as a weapon were themselves being branded with it by others. The Queen's name became a circular firing squad in the ongoing culture wars of America. The sexual revolution of the 1960s saw conservative religious voices revive Jezebel rhetoric with renewed intensity. Women wearing miniskirts or advocating for reproductive rights were labeled modern Jezebels, supposedly drawing society toward moral collapse, just as the ancient queen had drawn Israel toward Baal worship. Her name became shorthand for any feminine challenge to traditional authority. Even in contemporary workplaces, echoes of this ancient insult continue to linger. A woman described as ambitious frequently faces whispers suggesting manipulation and scheming, traits attributed to Jezebel across centuries. Professional assertiveness in women still calls up associations with the painted queen at her window, presumed to rely on charm and calculation rather than genuine merit and skill. The music and entertainment industries embraced and at times reclaimed the Jezebel archetype. Blues singers wove her into lyrics, sometimes identifying with her power, sometimes issuing warnings about women like her. When Frankie Lane sang Jezebel in 1951, "Jezebel, Jezebel, if ever the devil was born without a pair of horns, it was you. Jezebel, it was you." He cemented her place in popular culture as the ultimate dangerous woman. In a strange turn of linguistic fate, some African American communities reclaim Jezebel as a term of empowerment, a way of describing a woman too strong, too self-determined, too unwilling to diminish herself for society's comfort. This act of reclamation follows a familiar pattern, the effort to drain poison from a word by claiming ownership of it. The ancient queen herself might have appreciated this defiant response to her tarnished legacy. The Internet age gave rise to websites like Jezebel.com, consciously adopting the name to signal feminist commentary willing to challenge patriarchal norms. This modern usage attempts to rehabilitate the name entirely, suggesting that history's Jezebels may simply have been women who refused to know their place, a quality now celebrated rather than condemned. Today, when someone calls a woman Jezebel, they rarely think about 9th century B.C. Israelite politics or Phoenician religious practices. They invoke centuries of accumulated meaning, female sexuality as dangerous, female ambition as manipulative, female power as inherently corrupting. Few who use the name could tell you anything meaningful about the actual queen who lived and died in ancient Samaria. Yet they carry the full weight of her name, usually unaware of the burden it holds. Jezebel in art and literature. Artists across centuries could not resist her story. Jezebel's dramatic life and death offered everything they craved: beauty, power, violence, and divine retribution, all wrapped together in an exotic setting. On canvas after canvas, they reimagined her. Each generation projected its own fears and fascinations onto this ancient queen. Medieval manuscript illuminators typically depicted her as small and stylized, a crowned figure tumbling from a window while dogs waited below. These simple illustrations functioned as moral warnings rather than portraits, theological footnotes about the wages of sin. The artist showed little concern for historical accuracy. Jezebel wears medieval European clothing in their illustrations, her Phoenician origins entirely forgotten. Renaissance painters transformed her completely. In their hands, she became voluptuous and pale-skinned, draped in sumptuous fabrics that barely contained her form. Gustave Moreau's famous 1865 painting presents her as an exotic temptress surrounded by ivory and gold, her beauty untouched even as death approaches. These artists were not illustrating biblical history so much as creating sensual fantasies wrapped in the garments of religious respectability. The Pre-Raphaelites found in Jezebel a perfect subject, beautiful, doomed, and morally complex. John Byom Liston Shaw's 1896. Jezebel captures her final moments with theatrical, clear-throat intensity. She stands proud in royal purple while servants prepare her for death. The painting captures something frequently missed in simpler retellings, namely her dignity and defiance in the face of inevitable destruction. Theatrical presentations took even greater liberties with her story. When playwright Jean Rhine wrote Athalie in 1691, he focused on Jezebel's daughter, Athaliah, but his portrayal of the mother's lingering influence carried all the dread that European audiences associated with her name. The play's success helped to firmly cement Jezebel's reputation as the ultimate wicked queen in the Western imagination. Opera found in Jezebel a natural subject. High drama, powerful emotions, and spectacular death scenes provided everything composers desired. Yet, strangely, few major operas place her story at the center. She appears instead in references and comparisons. Her name invoked whenever a librettist needed shorthand for feminine evil. This absence as a protagonist says something uncomfortable about her story. Perhaps she remained too powerful, too autonomous for comfortable dramatic consumption. Literary treatments prove more varied and nuanced. When Marcel P. referenced her in Search of Lost Time, he used her as a symbol of how society transforms human beings into simplistic archetypes. Herman Melville made similar use of her in Moby Dick, demonstrating how names carry histories that shape perception far beyond rational thought. Modern novels have attempted more sympathetic portrayals. Elalanina Diong's 1956. Jezebel was among the first to imagine the story from the queen's own perspective, suggesting she was simply following the traditions of her culture in a foreign land. More recent fictional accounts, including The Witch of Jezreel by Thea Kenyon and Jezebel, The Untold Story by Leslie Hazelton, explicitly position themselves as correctives to centuries of one-sided portrayals. Contemporary art has found fresh resonance in her story. Feminist artists reference Jezebel when exploring how powerful women face demonization across time. Photographer Renee Cox's controversial work, Yo Mama's Last Supper, does not directly depict Jezebel, but engages with closely related themes of how female bodies become contested ground in religious and cultural conflicts. The literary journal Jezebel's Daughter began publishing women's writing in 2010, explicitly seeking to reclaim her legacy as a woman whose story was written entirely by her enemies. Their manifesto states, "For too long Jezebel has been a name hurled at women who refuse silence. We name ourselves after her in solidarity with all whose stories have been twisted to serve others' purposes." Children's Bible illustrations continue the tradition of simplifying her into a straightforward villain. Painted face, haughty expression, jewels signifying nothing but vanity. These images, encountered by children before they possess the critical tools to evaluate sources, ensure that each new generation absorbs the traditional view long before encountering any revisionist perspective. Theatrical productions increasingly reach for nuance in her characterization. A 2018 off-Broadway play titled Painted imagined Jezebel's inner thoughts as she applied her makeup for the final confrontation, exploring themes of performance, power, and facing death entirely on one's own terms. The one-woman show received critical acclaim for humanizing a figure long reduced to caricature. Perhaps most revealing is how visual depictions of Jezebel reflect the beauty standards of their respective eras, rather than any historical accuracy. From pale Renaissance ideals to exotic Orientalist fantasies to modern diverse representations, artists tell us far more about themselves than about the actual Phoenician queen. She becomes a mirror reflecting each society's attitudes toward female power, foreign influence, and moral authority. In every brushstroke and every written word about Jezebel, artists expose the enduring human fascination with women who defy boundaries. Though her body was consumed by dogs, her image has been repeatedly resurrected, reinvented, and reimagined. Proof that a powerful woman, even one reviled in sacred texts, never truly disappears from cultural memory. Jezebel in pop culture. Her name sells magazines. In 1957, Jezebel appeared on newsstands, a publication featuring pin-ups and provocative stories that would seem tame by today's standards, but genuinely shocked conservative America at the time. The publishers knew exactly what they were doing. 3,000 years after her death, Jezebel still signified forbidden sexuality and dangerous allure. Music could not resist her powerful symbolism when Frankie Lane's Jezebel topped the charts in 1951. Listeners thrilled to lyrics describing a woman born with a heart of stone. The song's popularity spawned cover versions across genres, from Edith Piaf's passionate French interpretation to Shirley Bassey's dramatic delivery. Each singer found something different in the ancient queen's story. Iron and Wine's haunting 2005 song Jezebel took a far gentler approach. "Who's seen Jezebel? She was born to be the woman we could blame. Make me a beast, half as brave. I'd be the same." These lyrics point towards something deeper. How convenient it is to have female villains who absorb our cultural shadows, allowing everyone else to appear more righteous by comparison. Hollywood discovered Jezebel's dramatic potential early. The 1938 film Jezebel, starring Bette Davis, does not actually retell the biblical story. Instead, It features a headstrong southern belle whose behavior echoes the ancient queen's defiance of social norms. The title alone conveyed everything audiences needed to know about the protagonist's character. Television references to her have scattered across decades of programming. Whenever a manipulative female character surfaces on crime dramas or soap operas, other characters often mutter Jezebel under their breath. Writers rely on audiences to decode this shorthand instantly. No explanation needed for one of culture's most enduring insults. Comic books and graphic novels have occasionally reimagined her story. In one notable example, Neil Gaiman's Sandman series references Jezebel obliquely through characters who, like her, suffer for defying religious orthodoxy. These sophisticated treatments assume readers already recognize the pattern: powerful woman, religious conflict, violent downfall. The fashion industry embraced Jezebel as shorthand for seductive, confident styling. Makeup collections, clothing lines, and perfumes have all adopted her name to signal bold femininity. The bitter irony here is sharp. The real Jezebel's painted face and royal garments were markers of her dignity and status, not tools of seduction. Yet, modern marketing transforms her final act of defiance into something as shallow as vanity. Internet culture gave birth to Jezebel.com in 2007, a website offering feminist commentary on news, politics, and pop culture. The deliberate choice of name repositioned the term, establishing the site as a voice willing to challenge prevailing narratives. Its popularity helped introduce younger generations to the ancient queen, typically framing her as misunderstood rather than villainous. Drag performance found rich material in Jezebel's dramatic potential. Drag queens performing under names like Jezebel Bible or Miss Jezebel create shows that play with themes of exaggerated femininity, power, and defiance, often with knowing winks toward how society punishes women who refuse to conform. These performances convert ancient tragedy into contemporary empowerment. Halloween costumes labeled Sexy Jezebel surface in online stores each October, typically featuring vaguely biblical styling combined with heavy eye makeup and revealing cuts. These commodified versions strip away all historical context and political complexity, reducing a queen who challenged prophets and kings to mere aesthetic shorthand for female temptation. Romance novels frequently employ Jezebel as a character description or even a title. These books often follow women initially perceived as manipulative, who gradually reveal hidden depths and vulnerability. This narrative arc unconsciously questions the traditional view of the biblical queen, suggesting that women labeled as Jezebels might simply be misunderstood. Comedy sketches and stand-up routines invoke her when discussing double standards. Men get called assertive for the same behavior that gets women called Jezebel. One comedian observes, highlighting how ancient narratives continue shaping modern perceptions of gender. The laughter. These jokes generate signals that audiences recognize the ongoing relevance of her story. Video games occasionally include Jezebel-inspired characters, typically sorceresses or corrupt queens who must be defeated. These digital incarnations perpetuate her role as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person worth understanding. Players defeat her without ever questioning whether history has treated her fairly. Perhaps most telling is how casually her name enters everyday speech. When someone calls a female celebrity a real Jezebel for behavior that would barely register criticism in a man, they unconsciously draw on centuries of gendered condemnation. The ancient queen becomes a conversational weapon, her complex historical reality buried beneath layers of moral simplification. The enduring presence of Jezebel in popular culture, from songs to websites, from fashion to films, reveals something important about collective memory. Historical figures who challenge fundamental social structures never truly die. They live on as warnings, as inspirations, as mirrors reflecting our own cultural anxieties about power, gender, and religious authority. Alternative histories. What if the dogs never came? Historians rarely pose such questions, preferring solid evidence to speculation. Yet sometimes imagining different outcomes illuminates what actually happened. If Jezebel had prevailed, if Jehu's rebellion had failed, and her religious reforms had taken lasting root, our world might look startlingly different today. Had Baal worship become the dominant faith of Israel, the monotheistic tradition might have developed along entirely different lines, or possibly failed to emerge as a world-shaping force at all. Judaism might have evolved into a minor regional sect rather than a distinct religion. Without that foundation, Christianity and Islam might never have appeared. Three world religions representing billions of believers across centuries, all potentially hinging on whether one queen's policies managed to endure. Religious scholars point to a fascinating possibility. Israelite worship was likely far more diverse and syncretistic than the biblical texts suggest. Archaeological evidence shows that many ordinary Israelites blended Yahweh worship with veneration of other deities, including Baal and Asher. Jezebel's policies may not have been imposing something alien on the population, but rather officially endorsing practices already common among ordinary people. Some historians suggest that Jezebel was genuinely attempting to build a cultural bridge, creating a multi-faith society where Phoenician and Israelite traditions could coexist. Her temples to Baal did not necessarily require abandoning Yahweh. They offered religious plurality. This vision of tolerance ultimately failed, replaced by Jews' violent enforcement of exclusive Yahweh worship. Marriage alliances such as the one between Jezebel and Ahab were standard diplomatic strategy in the ancient world. Had their partnership succeeded in creating lasting peace between Israel and Phoenicia, the northern kingdom might have withstood Assyrian pressure for longer through stronger coastal alliances. Israel's fall and the consequent loss of the 10 northern tribes, one of the defining tragedies in Jewish history, might have been delayed or even avoided entirely. Economic historians note that Phoenician trade connections strengthened Israel's economy considerably. Jezebel's cultural background included deep familiarity with Tyre's sophisticated commercial networks. Had her influence continued through her descendants, Israel might have developed stronger ties to Mediterranean trade, becoming more cosmopolitan and less vulnerable to inland empire builders. The prophetic tradition that defines so much of biblical literature emerged at least partly in opposition to royal policies, particularly those of Jezebel and Ahab. Had they prevailed, prophets like Elijah might be remembered as failed revolutionaries rather than spiritual heroes. The very concept of prophecy as the act of speaking truth to power might never have gained its central religious significance. Literary scholars point out that much of the Hebrew Bible took shape during or after the Babylonian exile, centuries after Jezebel's time. Had her religious policies become the accepted norm, later editors and compilers would have viewed her reign very differently. The texts describing her might praise her cosmopolitan vision rather than condemning her foreign practices. Perhaps most intriguing is considering how women's roles might have evolved along different lines. Phoenician culture generally afforded women higher social status than ancient Israel did. Had Jezebel established lasting influence, Hebrew society might have developed different gender norms altogether. Women's participation in religious and political life might have expanded, rather than contracted over subsequent centuries. The very concept of idolatry, so central to Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, gained much of its definition through opposition to the practices Jezebel supported. Without this defining struggle, monotheistic religions might have developed more visual and symbolic expressions of faith rather than emphasizing abstraction and textuality. Our understanding of what constitutes proper worship might be unrecognizable today. Military historians note that the coup succeeded partly due to external support from Assyria, which was eager to weaken Israel. Had Jezebel's descendants maintained power and continued Phoenician alliances, different regional power balances might have emerged. The geopolitical map of the ancient Near East, and consequently of world history, might have unfolded along entirely different lines. Modern religious pluralism continues to wrestle with questions that Jezebel's time also faced. Can multiple faith traditions coexist within a single society? Who holds the authority to determine acceptable religious practice? What happens when state power aligns itself with particular beliefs? Her failed experiment in cultural integration raises questions that remain unresolved in contemporary, multicultural societies. The violent swings between religious policies from Yahweh exclusivity to Baal tolerance and back again inflicted lasting trauma on ancient Israelite society. This recurring pattern of religious enforcement through state violence echoes throughout history. One wonders whether Jezebel's approach, had it prevailed, might have established different precedents for managing religious diversity. We will never know what might have been. Alternative histories remain speculative thought experiments. Yet considering paths not taken highlights the contingent nature of what we tend to treat as inevitable. History balanced on a knife's edge during Jezebel's reign. The religious landscape of our modern world, the living faiths of billions of people, might trace their origins back to whether one queen's vision withstood her enemies. Ahab reconsidered. We have misread him for centuries. While Jezebel commands attention with her dramatic defiance, her husband Ahab remains a shadowy figure, typically portrayed as weak-willed and dominated by his foreign wife. Yet careful reading of the available evidence suggests a far more complex man, a shrewd political operator navigating dangerous waters with surprising skill. The biblical writer offers contradictory portraits. In one breath, Ahab is condemned as having done more evil than all the kings before him. In the next, we see him dialoguing respectfully with prophets, expressing genuine remorse when rebuked, and showing real concern for his people. These inconsistencies hint at a ruler considerably more nuanced than later interpretations permitted. Archaeological evidence from his reign tells a different story than the religious texts do. Under Ahab, Samaria developed sophisticated water systems, expanded its fortifications, and engaged in wide-ranging trade. These achievements required vision, leadership, and administrative talent. The material record presents not a puppet king, but a capable ruler overseeing a genuinely prosperous society. His military record demonstrates strategic brilliance. When Ben-Hadad of Damascus besieged Samaria, Ahab negotiated shrewdly and then launched a surprise counterattack when the proposed terms became too humiliating. Later, at the Battle of Carmel, he contributed one of the largest chariot forces to a coalition that temporarily halted Assyrian expansion, preserving Israel's independence for another century. Modern scholars increasingly view the relationship between Ahab and Jezebel as a political partnership rather than one of domination. Their marriage alliance opened valuable trade routes with Phoenicia and secured Israel's western flank. Viewed within this framework, Ahab's tolerance of Baal worship appears less like weakness and more like calculated diplomatic policy, keeping the peace with a valuable ally. The famous story of Naboth's vineyard reveals real complexity in their relationship. While Jezebel orchestrates the plot, Ahab's initial response is telling. He does not command or threaten Naboth, but accepts his refusal and retreats into sulking. Only his wife's intervention turns desire into action. This suggests not that she controlled him, but that they operated in different spheres with complementary approaches. Jewish tradition developed a remarkably balanced view of Ahab, despite his negative portrayal in Kings. The Talmud notes that despite his religious failings, he presided over a time of prosperity, was respected internationally, and treated prophets with more patience than many supposedly righteous kings did. One rabbinic passage even suggests he has a place in the world to come. His relationship with the prophets reveals surprising tolerance. Unlike other kings who imprisoned or executed prophets who criticized them, Ahab maintained an open court where Elijah and Micaiah could speak freely, even when their messages directly condemned him. After Elijah's triumph at Mount Carmel and the slaughter of Baal's prophets, Ahab neither punished Elijah nor prevented his escape, a restraint remarkable by the standards of ancient monarchs. Ahab's death scene provides the most moving glimpse of his character. Warned by Micaiah that the battle would claim his life, he nonetheless led his troops personally, rather than sending others in his place. When mortally wounded by an arrow, he ordered his charioteer to prop him upright, facing the battle so his troops would not lose heart. He died at sunset, having stood bleeding for hours to preserve his army's morale. This is hardly the act of a weak man. Modern political analysis might view Ahab as a pragmatist caught between fundamentalist factions, facing zealous Yoists internally and powerful Phoenician allies externally. He attempted to balance competing interests through religious tolerance and cultural openness. Like many moderates throughout history, he satisfied neither extreme and was judged harshly by the faction that ultimately wrote the historical record. His son Ahaziah reigned just 2 years before dying in an accident. His second son Joram ruled for 12 relatively stable years before Jews' revolt, suggesting that Ahab had established institutions stable enough to outlast him. This legacy of governance contradicts the biblical portrayal of a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse due to his religious policies. Perhaps most telling is how Ahab appears in sources outside the Bible. Assyrian records from the Battle of Karkar describe Ahab the Israelite as a significant regional power, contributing more chariots than any other king in the coalition. These external perspectives show a ruler commanding genuine international respect, not a henpecked husband dominated by his wife. Marriage in ancient royal contexts functioned primarily as diplomatic alliance rather than romantic union. Viewing their relationship through modern assumptions about marital dynamics misses entirely the political nature of their partnership. Ahab gained Phoenician trade access and technology. Jezebel gained influence for her culture and religion. Their cooperation appears to have been both genuine and effective. As biblical scholar John Vanitas observes, in many ways, Ahab appears as the most secular of Israel's kings. Perhaps this worldliness, this focus on practical governance rather than religious purity, explains why religious texts treat him so harshly, while archaeological evidence points consistently toward administrative competence. Like many leaders whose priorities centered on stability and prosperity rather than ideological purity, his legacy suffered in texts written by those with fundamentally different values. The picture emerging from this reconsideration is not that of a saint wrongly maligned, but of a pragmatic ruler navigating genuinely complex political realities. Ahab's tolerance, viewed as weakness by biblical writers, might instead reflect calculated governance of a diverse and demanding kingdom. His willingness to accommodate different religious practices, far from marking him as Jezebel's puppet, suggests a ruler who understood that stability sometimes requires compromise. In the final accounting, Ahab stands revealed not as the shadowy consort of a dominant queen, but as her equal partner in a political alliance that brought both benefits and consequences to ancient Israel. Their story reminds us that history's simplest judgments so often obscure the complicated reality of those who lived, loved, ruled, and died in times very different from our own. The God who did not forget. The story begins and ends with Yahweh. Before Jezebel drew her first breath in Tyre, before Ahab ascended Israel's throne, the prophets were already speaking of one God who would tolerate no rivals. After her bones lay scattered in Jezreel's dust, after her name had become synonymous with defiance, that same God remained, watching, remembering, shaping history with patient hands. Ancient Near Eastern religions typically tied deities to specific places. Baal ruled storms in Canaan, Marduk held sway in Babylon, Ashur dominated in Assyria. Gods remained within their territories, powerful locally but limited geographically. Jezebel likely arrived in Israel carrying this worldview, bringing Baal not to replace Yahweh but to stand alongside him in his land. What she encountered was something fundamentally different. A deity who claimed dominion not merely over Israel, but everywhere. A God who declared all other gods to be nothing more than images of wood and stone. This universal claim made compromise structurally impossible. Where polytheistic systems absorbed new deities with relative ease, Yahwism's exclusive demands created inherent conflict with her Phoenician practices from the very beginning. The drought that struck during her early years in Samaria forms a pivotal moment in this theological confrontation. For 3 years, no rain fell. This was a direct challenge to Baal, the god of storms and fertility. When Elijah finally called fire from heaven at Mount Carmel, the central issue was not merely which deity existed, but which one actually controlled nature itself. The thunderstorm that followed Baal's defeat carried symbolic weight far beyond mere weather. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha were not simply court critics or social reformers. They claimed to speak directly for Yahweh. This prophetic tradition represented something unprecedented in ancient religion. Individuals standing outside temple or palace structures who declared divine messages that frequently contradicted official policy. Jezebel recognized them as threats not only to her religion, but to the very concept of royal authority itself. The biblical narrative frames her persecution of Yahweh's prophets not as ordinary religious intolerance, but as active rebellion against divine sovereignty. By silencing those voices, she was not merely implementing state religion, she was challenging Yahweh's right to speak through chosen messengers. This direct confrontation, the act of cutting off God's voice, escalated what might have remained cultural tension into full cosmic conflict. Names carry immense significance throughout the biblical account. Jezebel means, "Where is the prince?" In Hebrew, possibly a deliberate wordplay suggesting where is Baal. Her own name becomes a theological question, one answered decisively when Baal proved unable to save her from Jews' coup. Similarly, Elijah means, "My God is Yahweh," making the prophet's very identity a living declaration in the religious struggle. The violence marking her downfall reflected ancient understandings of divine justice. Jahus's bloodbath, eliminating not only Jezebel but all of Ahab's descendants, was not viewed as political brutality, but as divine cleansing. When dogs consumed her body, leaving only skull, feet, and palms, those who witnessed it saw not random scavenging, but precise fulfillment of prophecy. Every detail reinforced the same message. Yahweh remembers promises and executes judgment. Later, Hebrew prophets drew theological meaning directly from her story. Hosea, writing a century after her death, described Israel's unfaithfulness using imagery of an adulterous wife, drawing implicit comparison to Jezebel's influence. Ezekiel expanded this metaphor, describing Jerusalem as a faithless bride. These prophets transformed her legacy from political history into theological allegory about loyalty to covenant. The remarkable endurance of monotheism through subsequent centuries stands as indirect testimony to the significance of this religious struggle. Had Jezebel's religious policies prevailed, had Baal worship become normalized within Israel, the development of exclusive monotheism might have faltered. Instead, the traumatic purges under Jew and later kings reinforced the boundaries between Yahwism and other faiths, setting the stage for Judaism's eventual emergence as a distinct tradition. Christian interpretation added new dimensions to this divine narrative. Jesus' criticism of religious hypocrisy echoed Elijah's confrontation with false prophets. The Jezebel of Revelation symbolized internal corruption more dangerous than any external persecution. The patient God who orchestrated consequences for the queen's actions became the God who works through history toward ultimate redemption. Throughout this theological drama, Yahweh displays qualities that distinguish him sharply from other ancient deities. Unlike gods tied to natural cycles or specific geographical locations, He operates across generations, maintaining memory of both promises and threats long after the humans involved might have forgotten them. The decades separating Elijah's prophecy from Jezebel's death demonstrate divine patience, a willingness to work within human time while transcending it entirely. Jewish mystical tradition found deeper layers of meaning in her story. Kabbalistic interpretation saw Jezebel as representing Kelipot, the shells or husks that conceal divine light. Her destruction became symbolic of shattering the barriers that separate humanity from God. Even in her role as villain, she served a divine purpose, demonstrating how opposition ultimately clarifies rather than defeats spiritual truth. The religious landscape Jezebel entered had already been shaped by centuries of tension between exclusive Yahwism and more syncretistic practices. Archaeological evidence reveals household shrines featuring female figurines throughout Israelite settlements, suggesting that many ordinary people maintained older Canaanite practices alongside their worship of Yahweh. Her policies did not introduce foreign elements so much as elevate existing undercurrents to official status. This God who did not forget Jezebel has not forgotten her today. Her story continues shaping religious understanding of fidelity, compromise, and consequences. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities, though differing in many fundamental beliefs, share a commitment to monotheism, partly forged in the crucible of conflicts like those she represents. The theological boundaries she challenged have defined religious identity for billions of people across 3 millennia. Perhaps most profound is how her story illustrates divine sovereignty working through human freedom. Neither Jezebel nor Elijah nor Jew knew they were enacting a drama extending far beyond 9th century BCE politics. Each made choices for immediate reasons: power, survival, ambition, faith. Yet together they wove a pattern visible only from a historical distance. The biblical writers saw in this pattern not random events, but divine orchestration. For believers today, the God who remembered promises to Israel still remembers promises to them. For skeptics, the story demonstrates how powerful narratives shape history, regardless of their metaphysical truth. Either way, the confrontation between queen and prophet, between royal decree and divine command, between immediate political reality and eternal moral claim, continues to echo through history. A testament to how past conflicts shape present identities. The queen who would not bow, her final moment tells us everything. As Jew's chariot thundered toward the palace, servants fled and guards disappeared. Jezebel faced a choice. She could hide, disguise herself, or beg for mercy. She chose none of these options. Instead, she painted her eyes with kohl, arranged her hair, and placed herself at the window above the gate. Her last act was not surrender, but defiance. A queen to the bitter end. This gesture, the act of applying makeup before death, has been tragically misunderstood across the centuries. Critics called it vanity, as though she was primping herself to seduce her killer. The truth runs far deeper. In ancient Near Eastern courts, royal appearance was political statement. By donning her full queenly regalia, she faced death not as a frightened woman, but as Tyre's princess and Israel's queen. She died as she had lived, unbowed, unbroken, unwilling to surrender her identity or her authority. Her final words ring with bitter sarcasm. "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" By invoking Zimri, a military commander who had murdered his king but lasted only 7 days on the throne, she simultaneously acknowledged Yahus's coup and prophesied its ultimate failure. Even at the very threshold of death, she spoke not as a victim, but as a royal voice pronouncing judgment on a pretender. That final confrontation distills every theme running through her life. Born to rule in Phoenicia, she never accepted relegation to ceremonial status in Israel. While biblical authors condemned her independence, It reflected her upbringing in Tyre's cosmopolitan court, where royal women exercised genuine power. What Israel perceived as transgression, she understood as birthright. Running through her entire story is a thread that often goes unnoticed: consistency. Unlike kings who shifted their policies with political winds, Jezebel remained steadfast in her cultural and religious identity. From the moment she crossed into Israel until her body fell beneath the window, she maintained her Phoenician practices and beliefs. This constancy, condemned as stubbornness by her enemies, reveals an integrity rare among ancient rulers. Consider everything she faced: a foreign land hostile to her customs, prophets declaring her gods false, constant pressure to abandon her identity. Lesser figures might have compromised for the sake of safety or popularity. Jezebel refused. Whether driven by religious conviction, cultural pride, or political strategy, she held her course despite mounting opposition. This steadiness commands reluctant respect, even from those who remain critical of her. Her methods invite more complicated assessment: the persecution of Yahweh's prophets, the judicial murder of Naboth, the aggressive promotion of Baal worship. These actions cannot simply be excused as cultural differences, yet they must be understood within their proper context. Ancient monarchies did not operate on principles of democracy or religious freedom. Every Near Eastern kingdom enforced state religion through mechanisms we would now consider oppressive. What made Jezebel exceptional was not her methods, but her situation: a Phoenician princess promoting Phoenician practices in Israelite territory. Had she enforced Yahwism in Phoenicia, history might remember her as a righteous missionary queen. Had she simply practiced Baal worship privately without public promotion, she might have been tolerated as an acceptable foreign consort. The unforgivable offense was her refusal to assimilate, her insistence that her gods and her customs deserved equal standing in her adopted homeland. Modern women in leadership still encounter echoes of her situation. Those who refuse to soften their approach or reshape their speech to match gendered expectations frequently find themselves labeled with terms carrying Jezebel's legacy: manipulative, scheming, unnatural. The powerful woman who holds her course despite criticism continues to trigger deep cultural anxieties about female authority. Despite centuries of vilification, admiration for her courage threads through alternative readings of her story. Jewish feminist theologian Tikvari Makensky noted that while biblical authors condemned her actions, they never once portrayed her as weak, fearful, or inconstant. Christian feminist scholars like Tina Pippin have observed that, unlike many biblical women recorded only in relation to men, Jezebel maintains a distinct identity and genuine agency throughout her narrative. Even her enemies acknowledged her significance. Her consistent portrayal as beautiful deserves examination. Ancient texts rarely mention female appearance unless it serves a specific narrative purpose. Jezebel's beauty becomes shorthand for foreign allure, the dangerous attractiveness of practices that differ from established tradition. Like Helen launching 1,000 ships, her beauty functions symbolically, representing the seductive power of cultural alternatives to exclusive Yahwism. Was she evil or principled, villain or victim, oppressor or simply different? These questions miss something essential about her complexity. Like most compelling historical figures, she resists simple categories. A princess raised to honor certain gods, a queen determined to preserve her identity, a woman who exercised power in ways her society deemed inappropriate. She contains far more than any morality tale can hold. Perhaps most remarkable is how thoroughly she integrated her convictions with her actions. Whether promoting Baal worship, confronting prophets, or meeting death with composed dignity, Jezebel demonstrated a rare alignment between belief and behavior. While biblical authors condemn the content of her convictions, the sheer strength with which she held them commands attention across millennia. In the final accounting, Jezebel stands as testament to the cost of defiance. Her story is not primarily about wickedness being punished. It is about the enforcing of boundaries, religious boundaries, cultural boundaries, gender boundaries, the very boundaries her existence challenged at every turn. The gruesome details of her death, the dogs consuming her flesh, the eraser of any burial place. These details serve as warnings about crossing lines a society deems sacred, yet she persists, refusing historical erasure, just as she refused submission in life. Despite every effort to reduce her to cautionary tale or theological object lesson, she emerges from ancient texts as remarkably stubbornly human, ambitious, devoted to her gods, protective of her interests, unwilling to quietly dissolve into foreign customs. The woman who would not bow in life refuses to lie flat in history. What remains when we strip away all the layers of interpretation? A Phoenician princess maintaining her identity in hostile territory. A queen exercising power according to her own understanding of what monarchy meant. A priestess honoring gods. She was raised from birth to worship. A woman meeting death with composed and unbroken dignity. These elements persist regardless of whatever moral judgment one passes on her actions. Her painted eyes still watch us across 3,000 years, challenging easy assumptions about power, gender, cultural assimilation, and religious exclusivity. The queen, who would not bow, continues asking uncomfortable questions about how societies respond to difference, and how history treats those who refuse to conform to prevailing norms. In her unflinching gaze lies her final victory. She remains unforgettable, even in defeat.